He threw the breakfast tray across the room himself. Not because the eggs were wrong. Not because the coffee was cold. Calder Ross, Dorian Kessler's most decorated lieutenant, hurled it at the woman carrying it because she walked too slowly past his office door, and because he could. Tray hit the hallway wall 2 inches from Mara Bellamy's face. Ceramic shattered. Orange juice ran down the baseboard. Calder didn't look back. Mara stood still, didn't flinch, didn't speak. Just crouched and began collecting pieces of broken plate from the floor with her bare hands while the sound of Calder's laughter faded down the corridor. She had learned in this house that stillness was armor. What Calder Ross didn't know, what none of them knew, was that while Mara Bellamy was on her knees cleaning his mess, she was also reading the house. The medication bottles lined wrong on the hallway credenza. The morning drink sitting untouched for the 3rd consecutive day. The smell of something faintly chemical clinging to the kitchen air that didn't belong there. And in the master suite, at the end of the hall, Dorian Kessler, the most feared man in 4 states, was dying. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of powerful people, stay with me. Because this story is about what happens when the one person no one bothers to watch turns out to be the only person paying attention. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what comes next. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Mara had been working in the Kessler estate for 11 months before anyone said her name correctly. Not the housekeeper who trained her. Not the housekeeper who trained her. Not the chef. Not the rotating security staff who checked her ID badge every single morning as though she might have become someone dangerous overnight. Certainly not Calder Ross, who called her the maid when he bothered to acknowledge her existence at all, and who had, on 3 separate occasions, handed her his dry cleaning ticket as though she were a valet service operating out of her own pocket. She had learned to answer to anything, or nothing. Invisibility had its own kind of logic in a house like this. The estate itself sat on 12 acres outside the city, behind a gate that required 2 separate key codes and 1 biometric scan to open. It was not a home. It was a fortress that had been furnished to look like a home: Italian marble, original oils, and gilt frames. A wine cellar that a sommelier visited twice monthly to rotate the inventory. Everything in it was expensive. Everything in it was chosen to project a specific kind of power. And at the center of all of it, for the past 3 weeks, Dorian Kessler had been getting smaller. Mara had noticed before the doctors did. That was the thing about being invisible. You saw the accumulation of small things. You were present when no one was performing. She had noticed the tremor in his left hand first. Not dramatic, not the kind of tremor that made glasses spill. Just a subtle hesitation when he reached for something, a fraction of a second where his fingers seemed to forget what they were doing. She'd seen it on a Tuesday, when she was replacing the hand towels in the study bathroom, and Dorian had come in unexpectedly and poured himself a glass of water from the carafe on the shelf. He didn't see her behind the bathroom door. He poured the water, lifted the glass, and his hand shook once, a quick, involuntary tremor before it steadied. He set the glass down without drinking, stood there for a moment looking at his own hand, then walked back out. Mara had filed it away and said nothing. Wasn't her place to say anything. She'd been told that explicitly during her orientation by the estate manager, a thin, precise man named Horatio Webb, who had explained the hierarchy of the household with the enthusiasm of someone reading from a policy document. The domestic staff did not initiate conversation with Mr. Kessler. They did not offer opinions. They did not make eye contact unless eye contact was requested. They were, functionally, furniture that moved. Mara had nodded at all of this. She needed the job. The pay was better than anything she'd found in the city. The quarters were clean, and she had specific, private reasons for staying close to this particular household that she had not shared with Horatio Webb or anyone else. She watched. She cleaned. She replaced towels and polished silver, and carried breakfast trays, and learned, over 11 months, exactly how this house breathed. By the time the doctors arrived in force, she already knew something was wrong that they weren't going to find. The medical team came in the 3rd week of Dorian's decline, when his private physician, a composed silver-haired man named Dr. Ellison Prath finally admitted that whatever was happening exceeded his singular expertise and requested a consultation. What arrived was not a consultation. It was an occupation. 12 specialists descended on the estate with equipment cases and laptop bags, and the particular brand of confident body language that expensive medicine produced in its practitioners, men and women who had never, in their professional lives, been wrong in a way that anyone had dared tell them about. They set up in the East Wing. They brought monitors, portable imaging equipment, a centrifuge. They drew blood with the frequency of a subscription service. They conferred in the hallway in murmuring clusters, tablets in hand, using terminology that the security staff couldn't follow and that Calder Ross pretended to understand when he stood at the edge of their circles, arms crossed, jaw tight. Mara moved through all of it. She brought coffee. She emptied wastebaskets. She replaced the paper towels in the hallway bathroom near the temporary lab they'd established in the east sitting room. And she listened. And she looked. And she noticed. She noticed that Dorian's urine, which she could observe indirectly from the patterns of his bathroom use and the specific medical waste protocols she'd been instructed to follow, had gone dark, not slightly discolored, dark amber, tending toward brown on the worst days. She knew what that meant because her mother had been a dialysis patient for 6 years, and Mara had spent those 6 years learning more about kidney function than she had ever wanted to know. She noticed that the muscle weakness in his legs had progressed. He'd stopped walking the length of the upstairs hallway. In the evenings, a habit she'd tracked for months. His physical therapist, who came Tuesdays and Thursdays, had begun leaving after shorter and shorter sessions, always with a tight expression that he smoothed away before reaching the front door. She noticed his medications. That was the thing that caught her hardest and held. Dorian Kessler was a man of consistent habits. She had learned his routines the way you learn a complicated piece of music, by repetition, by proximity, by paying attention to the moments when something was slightly off-tempo. His morning medications were taken at 7:15, always with 8 ounces of water, always before breakfast. He had a system. The medications sat in a small leather case on his nightstand, organized by day of the week, and each morning the case would be closed and moved to the left side of the nightstand after use. For the past 8 days, the cases had been sitting on the right side, unclosed. Mara had replaced his bathroom towels 19 times in the past 3 weeks and had walked past that nightstand on every single trip. Pills were going in. The case was being moved. But it was being moved wrong, and the case wasn't being closed, and no one else had noticed because no one else was in that room long enough, or often enough, or paying that particular kind of attention. She stood in the hallway outside his room on a Thursday evening, holding a stack of clean towels, and made herself think through it carefully. The medications were being taken. The case was being moved but not closed. Why would a man who had kept that case closed and properly positioned for 11 months suddenly change both habits simultaneously? He wouldn't, not voluntarily, which meant someone else was handling the medication at some point in the process and doing it slightly wrong and not noticing that they were doing it wrong, or they weren't trying to. The morning drink was the second piece. Dorian's chef, a thick-necked man named Gareth, who had worked in the estate kitchen for 4 years and who treated the kitchen as his personal kingdom, had introduced a new morning routine 6 weeks ago. A citrus health blend, grapefruit heavy, supposedly anti-inflammatory, allegedly recommended by the nutritionist the estate had brought in briefly before the nutritionist's contract had quietly ended. Gareth prepared it fresh every morning, and it was brought to Dorian's room on a tray alongside his medications. For the first 2 weeks, Mara had thought nothing of it. Wellness drinks were a thing that wealthy people had. She'd seen stranger habits in this house. Then her mother's voice, from some specific remembered conversation about dialysis and medication interactions, and the particular dangers of grapefruit with certain drug classes, surfaced in the back of her mind one morning while she was watching Gareth prepare the blend. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching him cut the grapefruit, 6 of them. Always 6, and she thought, statins. Dorian Kessler was on high-dose statins. She'd seen the medication bottles. She'd been close enough to read labels while cleaning, and she'd read them the way she read everything in this house. Automatically, cataloging, grapefruit and statins. She remembered the warning from her mother's medication sheets, remembered reading it out loud at her mother's kitchen table while her mother made tea. Grapefruit can cause dangerous levels of the medication to build up in your body. High-dose statins, 6 grapefruits every morning, for 6 weeks. She went still in the doorway of the kitchen, and Gareth looked up at her with the expression he always used on domestic staff. Mild contempt, barely dressed as indifference, and said, "You need something?" "Just passing through," Mara said. She wasn't passing through. She went directly to her room, sat on the edge of her bed, and typed grapefruit statin interaction into her phone, with hands that were not quite steady. What sound confirmed everything she feared, and introduced something worse. Grapefruit inhibited a specific enzyme in the gut responsible for breaking down statins. Without that enzyme, statin concentration in the bloodstream didn't just double or triple, it could increase tenfold with sustained daily consumption. At high enough concentrations, statins caused a condition called rhabdomyolysis, catastrophic muscle fiber breakdown. The dying muscle cells released proteins into the bloodstream that the kidneys couldn't process. The kidneys began to fail. The patient weakened, grew confused, experienced organ stress that looked, from the outside, like a complicated systemic illness that 12 world-class specialists might spend weeks diagnosing incorrectly. Mara sat on her bed for a long time. Then she thought about the medication case, about who was handling it. She had seen Gareth carry the morning tray to Dorian's room, personally on 3 separate occasions. This was unusual. Tray delivery was typically handled by one of the junior household staff, a young man named Pete, who worked mornings. Pete was cheerful and forgettable, and not the sort of person who managed to hold on to jobs in places like this for long. And yet Pete had been here for 14 months, and nobody seemed to think about him much, which was the kind of thing Mara had trained herself to notice about people. She had also, on one of those 3 occasions, seen Gareth pause in the hallway outside Dorian's room for approximately 40 seconds before entering. 40 seconds. Long enough to do something small. Long enough to do something that needed to be done quickly before anyone came around the corner. The problem was that Mara Bellamy was a housekeeper. She had no credentials, no medical training, no standing in this household beyond the service she provided. She had watched 12 specialists with combined experience measuring in centuries miss what she believed she had found, and she had exactly 0 reason to believe that any of them would listen to her. She also had 0 tolerance for watching a man die from something preventable while the people paid to keep him alive talked over each other in conference rooms. Her mother had died because 3 different doctors hadn't talked to each other about her medications for 14 months. Mara had watched that happen. She was not going to watch it happen again. She went to find Victor Hale. Victor Hale was not a man you went looking for casually. He was Dorian's primary lieutenant, not the flashy one, not the ambitious one. Calder Ross held those designations. Victor was the operational one. 54 years old, built like a retired linebacker who had maintained the disciplines but lost the bulk, with a stillness to him that Mara had clocked on her first week as something other than composure. It was readiness. Victor Hale was always ready for the next thing to go wrong, which was presumably why Dorian had kept him close for over 2 decades. He was in the security office when she found him, reviewing footage on a bank of monitors, with the focused attention of someone who had long since stopped finding surveillance footage interesting but still found it necessary. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "Bellamy," he said. Not a greeting exactly, more like an identification. "I need to talk to you about Mr. Kessler," she said, "about his morning drink." Victor's expression didn't change. "That's a medical matter. Talk to Dr. Prath." "I talked to Dr. Prath 20 minutes ago. He told me to go back to work." Something shifted in Victor's eyes. Not much he was too controlled for much, but something. "What about the morning drink?" she told him. "All of it. The grapefruit, the statins, the enzyme inhibition, the rhabdomyolysis, the dark urine, the muscle breakdown, the kidneys." She told him about her mother. She told him about the medication case and 40-second pause in the hallway, and the 3 occasions she'd watched Gareth deliver the tray, personally. She laid it out in the same order she'd assembled it, without embellishment, without asking him to trust her, just presenting what she had seen and what it connected to. When she finished, Victor was quiet for a moment that went on long enough that she began to wonder if she'd miscalculated him. Then he said, "The blood tests they've run, they tested for drug concentration? Standard panels. Yes. But grapefruit interaction elevates the medication itself, not a foreign substance. If they're not specifically testing for statin metabolites at elevated concentrations, they might not be looking for the right numbers." Victor looked at her for another long moment. "You know what would happen to you if you're wrong about this?" "Yes," she said. "Do you know what would happen to you if you're right, and they find out you knew?" She thought about that too. Yes. Victor stood up. He was 6 feet and some, and in the narrow security office, the movement was significant. "Wait here," he said. He was gone for 11 minutes. When he came back, he said, "Dr. Prath is going to run one additional panel. Statin and metabolite concentration, kidney function markers, muscle enzyme levels. Specific numbers, not general ranges." He paused. He wasn't enthusiastic. "I imagine not. If the results support what you're telling me, we'll talk about the next steps." He looked at her steadily. "If they don't, this conversation didn't happen." "Understood," Mara said. The results came back in 4 hours. The statin concentration in Dorian Kessler's bloodstream was 11 times the therapeutic threshold. His creatine kinase, the enzyme released by dying muscle tissue, was at a level that indicated severe rhabdomyolysis in progress. His kidney function markers were in critical range. Dr. Prath, to his credit, did not argue once he saw the numbers. He moved with the brisk, controlled urgency of a man recalibrating entirely and not wanting anyone to observe the recalibration. The morning drink was immediately discontinued. Gareth was removed from the kitchen by 2 members of the security staff while still wearing his apron, still holding a whisk with an expression on his face that was not quite surprise, which was itself a kind of answer. The grapefruit statin interaction was addressed with medication adjustments and aggressive hydration. Dorian's kidneys, caught before complete failure, began the slow work of recovery. And then, 3 days later, when Dorian Kessler was sitting up in bed for the first time in 2 weeks, and eating solid food for the first time in 1, Victor Hale brought Mara to his room. She had been in this room before, many times, replacing towels, adjusting curtains, carrying things in, and carrying things out. She had never been brought here, never stood in the center of the room with Dorian Kessler looking at her rather than past her. He was not what illness had made him look like from a distance. Up close, with some color returning to his face and the particular alertness of a man whose mind had never actually clouded. Even while his body was failing, he was sharper than she'd expected. His eyes moved over her with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who had been assessing people for a very long time. "Victor told me what you did," Dorian said. His voice was still rough, still not fully recovered, but there was weight behind it. "Told me what you noticed. Told me how long you'd been watching." Mara said nothing. There was nothing to say yet. "He also told me you went to Prath first." Dorian's eyes didn't leave her face. "And Prath told you to go back to work." "He did. But you didn't." "No." Dorian was quiet for a moment. The monitors beside his bed beeped softly. Outside the windows, the estate grounds were gray and still. Why not? She thought about her mother, about dialysis chairs and medication sheets, and 3 doctors who had talked past each other for 14 months. She decided not to say that, not because it wasn't true, but because this man didn't need her history. He needed a straight answer. Because it was fixable, she said, and you were running out of time. Dorian looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Victor, and something passed between them that was too abbreviated to read the shorthand. 20-plus years operating together. "The chef," Dorian said to Victor. "Not a question. Being dealt with," Victor said. "And the doctor. Off the estate as of this morning." Dorian nodded slowly. Then he looked back at Mara. "You're going to stop carrying towels," he said. Starting now, she waited. Victor needs someone who can move through this house without being noticed. Someone who pays attention to details that people with authority stop seeing because they've stopped looking. He paused. I need to know what's happening in my own house. You've already demonstrated you can do that better than the people I was paying substantially more to do it." Mara said, "What does that mean, exactly?" "It means you're not the housekeeper anymore. He said it flatly, not offering her a promotion, telling her what was going to happen. It means you report to Victor. It means you keep moving through this house the way you always have. But now you're looking for something specific. What am I looking for? Dorian's eyes were steady. Whoever gave Gareth his instructions, he said. Because Gareth is not the kind of man who thinks of something like this himself. Mara felt something settle in her chest. Not satisfaction, it wasn't that clean. Something more complicated. The sense of a door opening onto a room she had not entirely decided to enter. There's something else, she said. Both men looked at her. 3 days ago, before the test results came back, Mr. Kessler, she stopped herself. You opened your eyes while I was in the room, changing the IV stand. The night shift nurse had stepped out. You were alone except for me. She paused. You said something. Dorian's expression didn't change. You said, don't let them kill me. The room was very quiet. I don't know which them you meant, Mara said. But I think you already knew it wasn't the disease. The silence stretched. Outside, a car moved slowly along the estate drive, its headlights sweeping briefly across the curtains. Victor hadn't moved. Dorian said finally, No, I didn't know, but I suspected. Then we need to find out who knew about your medications, Mara said, and who knew about the grapefruit, and who knew about the grapefruit, and who knew enough to make it look like a natural progression of illness instead of a poisoning. The word landed in the room with a specific weight. Dorian said yes, and we need them to believe it's still working, Mara said. They think you're recovering too fast. They'll change approaches. For the first time since she'd walked into this room, something moved across Dorian Kessler's face that wasn't assessment. It was something closer to recognition, the particular look of a man who had just seen something he hadn't expected to see, something that recalibrated a prior assumption. Victor, he said. Already thinking about it, Victor said, they would fake the decline. Dorian would remain, officially, critically ill. The medical team would be managed with selective information, and Mara Bellamy would move through the estate the way she always had, invisible, systematic, methodical, while the people who had tried to kill Dorian Kessler waited for news that wasn't coming. She was still wearing her housekeeper's uniform when she walked out of that room, still had the master key clipped to her belt, still had the work schedule folded in her pocket. But she was not going back to carrying towels. The first thing she did was go to the kitchen and look very carefully at how 6 grapefruits got from the walk-in refrigerator to Gareth's cutting board every morning. There was a receiving log for produce deliveries, standard practice in any estate kitchen of this size. She went through 3 weeks of entries. The grapefruit delivery had begun 6 days after a new produce supplier had been added to the estate's accounts. The account had been approved by Calder Ross. She wrote nothing down. She held it in her head, the way she held everything, and walked out of the kitchen and into the long corridor that connected the service wing to the main house. And she began, systematically, think about who in this household had access to produce procurement records, who had proximity to Dorian's medications, and who had enough knowledge of the estate's medical protocols to understand that a 6-week grapefruit intervention would look, to anyone not specifically looking, like a natural deterioration. Gareth had delivered the tray 3 times personally. Pete, cheerful, forgettable, Pete had delivered it every other morning. She needed to look at Pete more carefully. She also needed to look at the timing of Calder Ross's recent behavior. The tray incident in the hallway, the thrown tray, the laughter had happened 4 days after Dorian's decline became visible to the household. Calder had been performing, she realized, not cruelty for its own sake. Calder was a man who performed when he was managing something, when he needed the staff to be focused on him rather than on anything else. She filed that away with everything else and kept walking. By the time she reached her own room, that evening she had the beginning of something. Not a conclusion, not yet, but the outline of a structure. Someone had planned this carefully. Someone had access to the estate's internal systems, the medical records, the staff schedules. Someone who understood that the most effective way to kill a man like Dorian Kessler wasn't a bullet. It was something slow and deniable and clinical, something that looked like the body failing on its own terms. Someone who knew this house nearly as well as she did. She sat on the edge of her bed in her uniform, still wearing her work shoes, and thought about who in this hierarchy had the most to gain from Dorian Kessler's death, about who had been closest to the information required to make this work, about who had approved a new produce supplier without anyone questioning it, and why. Calder Ross. She thought about his face when he walked past Dorian's closed door. Not grief, not anxiety. Management. Pure management. The face of a man who was tracking a timeline. She thought about the medication case, open and wrong on the nightstand, about 40 seconds in a hallway. And she thought about the fact that someone still inside this house, someone still walking its corridors, still eating at its tables, still sitting in its meetings had given Gareth his instructions, and that someone did not yet know that Dorian Kessler was going to survive. That was the only advantage she had, and she intended to use every second of it. Pete smiled too much. That was the thing Mara kept coming back to. In the first gray hours of the morning, sitting on the edge of her bed with her shoes still on, and the estate quiet around her, in the specific way that large houses got quiet after midnight, not peaceful, just suspended. Pete Harlow, the junior morning staff member who had worked this house for 14 months and somehow never acquired the wariness that everyone else here carried, like a second uniform. Pete, who said good morning to the security guards by name. Pete, who left small notes on the kitchen whiteboard, smiley faces, drawn in blue marker next to the produce order reminders. Nobody smiled that much in Dorian Kessler's house without a reason. She pulled out the work schedule she still had folded in her pocket-old habit. She'd been carrying the weekly schedules since her second month on staff because Horatio Webb printed them on Monday mornings, and nobody else seemed to read them carefully enough to notice when someone quietly adjusted their own hours. And she spread it flat on her knee and looked at it in the thin light from her bedside lamp. Pete's shifts for the past 6 weeks, every morning, 7 to noon, 5 days a week. He had been the one carrying Dorian's breakfast tray on most of those mornings. She'd assumed that was simply his assigned task. Junior staff, morning shift, tray delivery. Logical. Except she now remembered that tray delivery had not originally been part of the morning staff rotation. It had been added to the schedule approximately 8 weeks ago in handwriting that was not Horatio Webb's neat block print. Someone had penciled it in, small, slightly tilted letters. She had looked at that schedule every Monday for 11 months and had not noticed until this moment that the handwriting on that one line was different from everything around it. She folded the schedule back up, put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, not her work pocket. Closer. Sleep was not going to happen. She went to work instead. The estate in the early morning hours had a different architecture than it did during the day. The security staff rotated in pairs, and she had learned their patterns the way she'd learned everything else here, by being present during the transitions, by watching without appearing to watch. The East Wing corridor was unwatched between 2:15 and 2:40 During the shift handoff, the kitchen was empty after the night staff finished cleanup at midnight, and before Pete arrived at 7. She had 4 hours. The kitchen receiving log was kept in a binder. In the pantry office, a small room off the main kitchen that smelled of cardboard and industrial cleaner and was used primarily for storing paperwork that nobody ever looked at. She had cleaned this room 8 times. She knew where the binder was kept, knew the shelf, knew that it sat between a fire safety inspection record and a quarterly inventory form that had not been updated since February. She found the grapefruit entry exactly where she expected it. 6 units delivered 3 times weekly, beginning on a Thursday 6 weeks ago. The supplier code in the margin was a 4-digit number she didn't recognize, different from the codes for the estate's regular produce suppliers, which she had incidentally memorized over 11 months of watching web cross-reference deliveries against invoices. She photographed the page with her phone. Then she went back 3 weeks further in the log and found the entry for the new supplier's account activation, approved by C. Ross, signed and dated in Calder's angular, impatient handwriting. She photographed that too. She was replacing the binder on its shelf when she heard footsteps in the main kitchen. Not the loose, shuffling footsteps of someone who'd forgotten something and come back for it. These were careful footsteps, deliberate. Someone moving quietly through the kitchen in the dark, not turning on lights. Mara pressed herself flat against the pantry office wall to the left of the open doorway, and did not breathe. Footsteps stopped near the counter. She heard a drawer open, the soft sound of something being placed on the counter, small, light. Then the drawer closing. The footsteps moved again, toward the service entrance at the back of the kitchen. The service door opened and closed. Mara waited 30 seconds, then moved to the counter. In the thin ambient light coming through the kitchen windows, she could see clearly enough. The drawer was the one nearest the prep station, the one that held the small utensils, the measuring spoons, the equipment used daily for the morning routine. She opened it carefully. Everything looked exactly as it always did. Measuring spoons nested together, a small funnel, 2 specialty corkscrews, a digital kitchen scale, and underneath the digital scale, face down, a folded piece of paper that had not been there the last time she cleaned this drawer, which had been yesterday afternoon. She picked it up, unfolded it. In the dim light, she could make out a handwritten sequence, not words, just numbers. 7 of them, separated by dashes. A phone number or a sequence that functioned like one. Below the numbers, 3 words, Thursday. Last time. She folded it back exactly as she'd found it, replaced it under the scale, and closed the drawer. Thursday was 2 days away. She went back to her room and sat with what she had until the light began to change outside her window. And then she went to find Victor Hale. Victor was already awake. She suspected he was always already awake. She had never in 11 months caught him in a state that looked like transition. He was in the security office with coffee and 3 monitors, and when she appeared in the door, he looked up with the particular expression of a man who had been expecting her to appear, but hadn't known exactly when. "You were in the kitchen," he said. She wasn't startled. He had eyes on the kitchen, of course. She half anticipated this. "I found something in the receiving log," she said. "I know about the grapefruit log." His voice was flat, not dismissive, something else. Controlled in the way that meant he was managing how much he let out. "I pulled those records myself 2 days ago." "Then you know Calder's signature is on the supplier approval." "I know. And that's a problem," she said, "because that's not nothing. That's not a lieutenant who happened to sign off on a produce supplier. That's a signature on the document that started all of this." "I know what it is, Bellamy." She looked at him. "Then why hasn't it gone to Dorian?" The silence lasted long enough that it became its own kind of answer. Victor set down his coffee. He turned in his chair to face her directly, and she saw something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not uncertainty, but the careful management of a man, handling something that had more edges than he'd initially accounted for. "Because Calder Ross has been with this organization for 16 years, Victor said. "Because if we take that signature to Dorian without understanding what it's connected to, we either move on Calder premature and lose the thread back to whoever is actually directing this, or we alert Calder that we're looking at him, and he disappears before we find anything." Mara absorbed this. It was not wrong. "Or," she said, "Calder is the one directing it, and every day we wait is a day he's still in this house, with access to everything." "Yes," Victor said. "That's also true. He's not working alone," she said. Told him about the kitchen, the footsteps, the drawer, the folded paper with the phone number and the 2 words, Thursday. "Last time." Victor went very still. "Someone came into the kitchen at 2 a.m. to leave a message in a drawer," she said. "Someone who knows where things are kept and how to move through the house quietly. That's not Calder. Calder doesn't know how this kitchen works at that level. But it might be someone Calder told." "Pete," Victor said. "Pete's been on that morning shift for 6 weeks. He has access to the medication sequence, the tray, the kitchen, all of it. And the schedule edition that put tray delivery in his rotation was written in someone else's handwriting." Victor stood up. When he moved with that particular controlled speed, it was like watching a machine engage no wasted motion, no hesitation. He went to the second monitor and pulled up the security footage archive, and his hands moved over the keyboard with a practiced efficiency that made Mara wonder, not for the first time, what Victor Hale had been before Dorian Kessler had employed him for 23 years. Footage from the kitchen, 2 a.m., was clear enough. The figure moving through the kitchen was wearing dark clothing and keeping their face angled away from the cameras deliberately, practiced, but the build was right for Pete. And the way they moved through the space, the specific route they took, the unerring navigation in the dark, spoke to someone who had spent a significant amount of time in that kitchen memorizing its geography. "That's Pete," Victor said. His voice had gone flat in the specific way that meant a decision was being made. "He's picking up or leaving contact information," Mara said. "Either way, Thursday is the relevant date. Something happens Thursday, or someone calls that number on Thursday, or Pete makes a move Thursday." Victor looked at her. "You want to be there. I want to know what's in that drawer Thursday morning," she said. "And I want to know who Pete calls, or who calls him." Victor was quiet for a moment. "I'll handle Thursday. You do something else for me." "What?" "Calder is meeting with the medical team this afternoon. Status update on Dorian's condition. I want to know exactly how he reacts when Prath tells him the deterioration is progressing." He paused. "We're going to tell the medical team to keep reporting decline. As far as they're concerned, Dorian is still critical. As far as Calder is concerned, the plan is working. And what's actually happening? Dorian's kidney function improved 12% overnight. His muscle enzyme levels are dropping. He's weak, but the trajectory is up, not down." Something moved through Victor's expression, not quite relief, but its functional cousin. "He's going to make it." Mara nodded. "Calder can't know that. Nobody outside this room. And Dorian's room knows that," Victor said, "including Prath's team. They've been told to maintain their current assessment in all external communications." She thought about the shape of this. The fake decline, the contained information, the careful performance of crisis, maintained for an audience of one Calder Ross, watching and waiting for a death that was no longer coming. "He'll push," she said. "When the timeline stretches longer than expected, he'll push for confirmation. He'll want to know why it's taking so long." "I expect him to," Victor said. "That's when he makes a mistake." She left Victor and spent the morning doing the thing she'd learned to do better than almost anything in the house. Moving through. She carried a cleaning caddy she no longer technically needed, but it was the best possible cover she had, and she was not ready to abandon it. The medical team was in the East Wing. The security staff was doubled on the main corridors. And Calder Ross was in his office on the second floor with the door half open, which was a thing she'd noticed he did when he was thinking left the door open to hear the house, to feel its pulse. She found a reason to clean the sconce fixtures in the second-floor hallway at 2 in the afternoon, just before the medical briefing. Dr. Prath walked past her toward Calder's office at 2:07. She heard the door open fully, heard the muffled sounds of Prath's voice beginning what sounded like a prepared presentation. He had that quality in his voice, the cadence of rehearsal. She worked the sconces with deliberate slowness and listened to the portions that carried. No significant improvement in the metabolic markers. Kidney function remains compromised. We're managing acute symptoms, but the underlying... She couldn't hear Calder's responses directly, but she could hear his voice, and what she was hearing was not the voice of a man receiving difficult news. It was too even, too smooth. A man who was listening to a briefing he had expected to receive, confirming information he had already accounted for. Then, near the end, Calder's voice rose slightly, and she caught it clearly through the half-open door. "How long?" Prath's response was quieter, and she caught only fragments. Difficult to say with certainty. The body's response to treatment has been, "We're cautiously hoping for." "Give me a number," Calder said. Sharp, impatient in a way that cut through his composed surface. Prath said something she couldn't hear. Calder said, "That's too long." The words sat in the hallway air for a moment, and Mara's cloth stopped moving on the sconce fixture without her consciously deciding to stop it. Too long, not too short, not too uncertain, too long. A man watching someone he cared about suffer would not use that phrasing. A man who needed something to happen on a specific timeline would. She started cleaning again before Prath emerged from the office and was 3 feet down the hallway, moving away by the time his footsteps hit the corridor. She went directly to Dorian's room. The security outside his door, 2 men now, both of whom she recognized from the estate's long-term staff, let her pass with a look at her face rather than her badge. That was new. That was Victor's doing. She knocked twice, opened the door. Dorian was sitting up, not significantly propped against pillows, with the monitors still running and an IV still in his arm, maintaining the appearance of acute illness. But his eyes were sharp and tracking, and he looked at her when she came in with the full attention of someone who had been waiting. Calder said too long, she said. When Prath gave him a timeline, Dorian's jaw moved, not quite clenching something more controlled. When? 20 minutes ago. The briefing. You were in the hallway, cleaning the sconces. Something that might have been amusement crossed his face, brief and complicated. Sit down, he said. There was nowhere obvious to sit in the arrangement of medical equipment, so she moved the visitor chair from the corner and sat in it. They were roughly at eye level. Dorian looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his working face, the face underneath the face he showed to people he wanted to manage. Victor told me about the kitchen, he said. The note, Thursday. Yes. And Pete. Yes. Pete's been in my house for 14 months, Dorian said. He said it not with anger, but with a specific, quiet quality that was worse than anger. Quality of a man accounting for something. 14 months. He knows the morning routine. He knows where things are kept. He knows which cameras have which coverage angles. He's been positioned, Mara said. Someone put him here before they needed him, long enough that nobody was paying attention to him anymore. She paused. That takes planning. That takes someone who knew this house's hiring timeline and staff rotation well enough to seed a person 14 months in advance. Dorian was looking at her. That's not Calder. She had been thinking this since the kitchen. No. Calder is ambitious and careless in specific ways. He signs documents without thinking through their paper trail. He reacts on timelines he doesn't fully control. He's useful to someone, but he's not the architect. Then who is? Someone who knows your organization well enough to map its vulnerabilities from the outside, she had said. Someone with the patience to plan assets a year in advance. Someone who understood that the best way to take this operation wasn't a direct move, it was a slow collapse from within. Starting with you. Dorian said nothing for a moment. Varric, he said. The name landed in the room differently than she expected. Not like a surprise, but like a word that had been sitting in the back of a throat for a while, waiting. You know him, she said. Silas Varric. He runs the Coastal Syndicate. Dorian's voice had gone to that flat register again. We've been in contested territory for 3 years. He's tried 2 direct moves, both failed. He's not stupid. He would have learned from that. Then he changed his approach, Mara said. Patient, indirect, deniable. If it's Varric, Calder is working for him, Dorian said. Either willingly or being leveraged, or he was recruited. Calder has debts. I noticed the financial stress about 4 months ago. The lease on his personal vehicle changed, a downgrade, and he's been borrowing from petty cash in the household accounts, in amounts small enough that Webb doesn't flag them, but regular enough that they add up. She saw Dorian's expression shift. I track the household accounts as part of my duties. I noticed. You noticed, he repeated. Someone in debt, with ambition, working for a man who doesn't include him in the inner circle the way he wants to be included. She paused. Varric would know how to approach that conversation. Dorian leaned back into the pillows. He looked, for a moment, genuinely tired, not the performed tiredness of the fake decline, but the real exhaustion of a man who had been nearly killed inside his own home by someone he trusted with proximity. I want to know who Pete contacts Thursday, he said, and I want it recorded. Victor is handling it. I know Victor is handling it. I want you there too. He looked at her directly. You see things Victor misses. Victor sees threats. You see systems. She thought about that. It was accurate. And it was also the kind of thing that Dorian Kessler would only say if he had already decided to use it. What are you planning? I'm planning a syndicate gathering, he said. 2 weeks out. It was already scheduled quarterly meeting of the regional leadership. I'm going to attend it. She stared at him. You're supposed to be critically ill. I know. If Varric's people see you at full capacity. They won't see me at full capacity. They'll see me weak and barely recovered and making a premature appearance that looks like pride and poor judgment. The flatness in his voice had a current underneath it now. And while everyone in that room is watching me appear to make a mistake, you're going to be watching them. She understood the shape of it then. The fake decline wasn't just about buying time. It was about creating an audience. People who thought they were watching, a dying man's last performance, would drop their guard in ways that people who knew he was recovering would not. "You're going to use the gathering to find the confirmation," she said. "The direct link between Calder and Varric. I need more than a signature on a produce order," Dorian had said. "I need something that holds in front of every person in that room. Something that makes it impossible for Varric to reframe." "What kind of something?" "That's what you're going to find before Thursday," he said. "And on Thursday, you're going to help me understand how deep Pete Harlow goes." She left his room and walked back through the estate's corridors, with the cleaning caddy still carrying it. The absurd armor of it, the way the bottles rattled softly against each other with each step. She passed Calder in the main hall. He looked at her the way he always had, which was the look of a man who was not looking, a flicker of acknowledgement that registered her as furniture and moved on. She watched the set of his shoulders as he walked away, particular tension in them. A man managing a timeline, a man who had said too long to a doctor's estimate and meant it from the gut. 2 days to Thursday. She spent those 2 days doing what she did best, moving through the house, listening at the edges of things. She catalogued 3 phone calls Calder made from the estate landline, the landline, not his cell, which was itself a choice that meant something, and noted the timing of each: morning, when the medical team was occupied; evening, when the house noise covered the sound of a door closing. She found Pete's personal locker in the staff room and looked at it without opening it, noting the specific scratch pattern on the combination lock that told her it had been opened recently, more often than a locker that held a change of clothes and a phone charger should need to be. She sat with Victor in the security office on Wednesday evening, and they watched the kitchen footage from the previous nights together, and on Wednesday, at 1:47 a.m., Pete was back in the kitchen, and this time he opened the drawer and removed the folded paper and replaced it with a different paper, smaller, and then left the same way he'd come. "He's completing a handoff," Victor said. "Someone leaves a message. He picks it up, leaves a confirmation." "A dead drop," Mara said, inside the estate. Victor's jaw was tight. "Someone on the outside is running a dead drop inside this house. Or someone on the inside has access to someone on the outside without using a phone or any traceable communication." She thought about it. Who delivers things to the kitchen? Besides, it's the produce suppliers. Victor turned to look at her. "The produce delivery happens 3 times a week," she said. "The driver has a gate code. The delivery is logged. But the driver isn't always supervised all the way to the receiving area. If a driver is willing to leave something in a specific place on the way in, and Pete picks it up on his morning shin shift, and leaves a response in the same place for the driver to collect on the next delivery." "We've been checking packages," Victor said, "scanning everything coming through the gate. You're checking for weapons, for devices. You're not looking for a piece of paper folded inside a produce crate." She paused. "Thursday is a delivery day." Victor stood up. The movement was abrupt in a way she'd never seen from him, the controlled machine showing a seam. "I need to make a call," he said. "Victor." He stopped. "If you alert the gate on Thursday, and the driver senses something is wrong, we lose the thread. We need to let it complete." He looked at her. The seam closed. "You're right," he said. The words came out like they had weight. They didn't come easily. "Let Pete pick up whatever is in that crate," she said. "Let him make the exchange. Then we see where the paper goes." Thursday arrived with gray skies and a produce truck at the gate at 7:12 a.m. Mara was in the kitchen at 6:45, cleaning the counters with the particular slow thoroughness of someone with nowhere else to be. Pete arrived at 7 with his key card and his smile, and said good morning to her with the ease of someone who had no idea that 3 cameras had been repositioned overnight, and that Victor Hale was sitting 40 feet away, watching a monitor. Pete unloaded the produce crates. He moved efficiently, stacking, sorting, and at one point, reaching into the 3rd crate from the bottom, he paused for a fraction of a second that anyone not watching for it would have missed entirely, and his hand came back out, empty. But his body had moved in the specific way that meant it hadn't come back out empty on the way in. Something had been transferred. He finished unloading. He washed his hands. He assembled Dorian's breakfast tray, with practiced, mechanical precision, the tray that no longer contained anything dangerous, that Victor had sanitized at the supply level 3 days ago without Pete's knowledge. He loaded it and walked toward the corridor. Mara followed at a distance that wasn't following. Pete took the tray to the second floor. Standard route. But outside Dorian's room, instead of knocking and waiting, he stopped and looked at his own hands. Just for a moment. Just long enough for Mara to see, from 20 feet down the corridor, that his hands were not as steady as his smile. He knocked. He was admitted. He was inside for 3 minutes, which was standard. When he came out, he walked back toward the stairs without looking in her direction. She waited until he was around the corner. Then she went to Victor's earpiece. She was wearing one now, a small thing that fit flush in her ear canal, and said quietly, "He's heading back down." "I have him," Victor said. The thing they found later was not dramatic. It was a folded piece of paper in Pete's jacket pocket, and on it, in the same slightly tilted handwriting she'd seen on the schedule edition weeks ago, 4 words and a date. Thursday next. He knows. The he in that sentence was the thing that stopped the room. Victor read it twice. Dorian, when Victor brought it to him, read it without any expression at all, which was worse than any expression would have been. "He knows," Dorian said. "Varric knows you're recovering," Mara said. "Or he suspects. Either way, Thursday next means something changes in 7 days. They're accelerating," Victor said. "They have to." Mara looked at Dorian. "The timeline they planned depended on you being gone by now." "You're not gone. That means whatever the next step is, they're going to move it forward before you're strong enough to respond." The room was quiet in the specific way that precedes a decision. Dorian folded the paper, set it on the bed beside him. "The gathering," he said. "I'm moving it to Thursday next." Victor said, "That's 7 days, I know. You'll still be recovering. You won't be at full strength. I know that too." Dorian looked at both of them in turn at Victor, then at Mara, with the same level, assessing gaze. "But Varric is going to move in 7 days, which means I need to be in that room with him before he does." Mara said, "You're going to walk into a room with the man trying to kill you." "I'm going to walk into a room with the man trying to kill me," Dorian confirmed, while he still thinks he has the advantage. She thought about what she needed in 7 days. She thought about the faint blue ink of Calder's signature on a Proteus approval form, about Pete's unsteady hands outside a door, about a folded paper in a kitchen drawer. She thought about what Varric would look like in a room full of people who depended on his ignorance of what she knew. She thought about the word confirmation, what Dorian had said he needed, something that holds in front of every person in that room. "I'll find it," she said. "I know you will," Dorian said. The simplicity of it landed strangely not a compliment exactly. More like a statement of operational fact, which somehow meant more than any compliment would have. She left the room. The corridor was empty. She stood in it for a moment with the cleaning caddy in her hand, the bottles quiet for once, and felt the specific weight of 7 days pressing against everything she had assembled. Somewhere in this house, Calder Ross was managing a timeline that had just been broken. Somewhere outside it, Silas Varric was making contingency plans. And Thursday next was not an ending. It was the moment when every piece she had been quietly moving would either hold together or come apart in front of everyone. She started walking. 7 days was not enough time. Mara knew this by the end of the first one. She had made a list in her head, not on paper, never on paper in this house, of what she needed before Thursday. A direct connection between Varric and Calder that went beyond the produce supplier signature. Evidence of Pete's communication chain that pointed upstream rather than just sideways. Something about the financial arrangement that would have made Calder's cooperation worth the risk of treason. And underneath all of that, the thing she hadn't said to Dorian or Victor yet, the thing that had been sitting at the back of her mind. Since she'd read the folded note, if Varric already knew Dorian was recovering, then someone closer than Pete had told him. Pete was a conduit. Pete carried paper between a produce truck and a kitchen drawer. Pete did not have access to Dorian's actual medical readings, to the specific numbers that would tell someone on the outside that the decline was reversing. For Varric to know to send a note that said he knows, with the confidence of current intelligence, he needed a source, inside the medical operation. Someone on Prath's team. She sat with this on Friday morning, while the estate moved around her in its new configuration, the doubled security. The quiet containment of information, performance of crisis maintained for an audience that was shrinking as Dorian's actual condition improved. She sat with it and turned it over and felt the specific vertigo of a problem that kept revealing new floors beneath the one you thought was the bottom. She started with the medical team's access logs. Victor had given her read access to the estate's internal system quietly, without ceremony, just a card slid across the security desk with a pin written on a post-it that she memorized and destroyed. She used it in the early mornings when the security office was quietest, pulling up records that were ordinarily above her clearance level and reading them with the same methodical patience she applied to everything. The access logs for the East Wing showed 12 individual entries per day, on average. The medical team, the security staff, called her twice, Victor 4 times, Mara herself 3. She looked at the timestamps. She looked at the durations. She looked for the anomaly. It took her most of Friday to find it. Dr. Nella Voss. She was the youngest member of the consulting team, mid-30s, a nephrologist brought in specifically because of the kidney involvement in Dorian's symptoms. She was quiet, technically precise, and had struck Mara, and in the brief observations she'd made during her cleaning rounds through the East Wing, as the most genuinely competent person on Prath's team. She asked better questions than the others. She was faster with the data. She was also accessing the patient records at 4A. Not every night, but 3 times in the past week the access log showed Dr. Voss entering the temporary records room in the East Wing between 50 and 4:15 a.m. Each session lasted less than 10 minutes. Each one was logged under her legitimate credentials. Question was what she was doing with what she read. Mara couldn't answer that from the access log, but she could look at what had changed in Dorian's recorded data, what the files showed versus what was actually true. And she could track whether Varick's intelligence seemed to correspond to the version of events in those files. It did, precisely. The note in the kitchen drawer had said he knows. It had arrived Thursday. The last 4 a.m. access before Thursday had been Wednesday night at 3:58 a.m. Dr. Nella Voss, 12 minutes. Records room. Mara closed the access log and sat in the dark security office with her hands flat on the desk and her breathing deliberately even. She thought about how to handle this. She could take it to Victor immediately. Victor would move on Voss, remove her from the estate, contain the leak. That was the operational response. Clean, fast, decisive. But if Voss was removed before Thursday, Varick would know the leak had been identified. He would change his approach. Whatever he was planning for Thursday next would shift, and they would lose the shape of it, lose the specific vulnerability they were currently positioned to use. She needed Voss to stay. She needed the leak to keep flowing, but to start carrying the wrong water. She found Victor at 6 in the morning and told him what she'd found and what she thought they should do. Victor listened without interrupting, which she'd learned was his version of focused attention. When she finished, he was quiet long enough that she could hear the estate's ventilation system cycling in the walls. You want to feed false information through Voss to Varick, he said. I want Varick walking into that gathering, believing Dorian is weaker than he is, believing the recovery has stalled, believing Thursday is still his moment. If Voss realizes she's being fed false data, she won't. She's reading files she's not supposed to be reading at 4 in the morning. She's careful about her access times because she doesn't want to be noticed. She's not going to question the content of what she finds because questioning the content would mean drawing attention to the fact that she was looking for it. Victor looked at her for a long moment. When did you get like this? He said. It was not quite a compliment. It was more calm. It was more like a man recalibrating the distance between where something was and where he'd thought it was. I've always been like this, Mara said. You just weren't paying attention. She spent Saturday managing the data. With Victor's authorization, she worked with the estate's medical liaison to adjust Dorian's recorded numbers not dramatically, not in any way that would make a trained nephrologist suspicious, but specifically. Creatinine levels held flat instead of improving. Muscle enzyme counts declining more slowly than the actual rate. the kidney function markers hovering at the lower edge of stable rather than the genuine modest improvement they reflected. Picture of a man who was not getting better fast enough. She also added one new detail, a notation in the attending record, written in Prath's name by the medical liaison, indicating that Dorian had experienced a brief period of confusion and disorientation on Friday evening. Duration, approximately 20 minutes. Possibly indicative of early encephalopathy related to renal stress. This was entirely fabricated. It was also the kind of detail that a medical professional looking to assess Dorian's actual capacity would find significant. A man experiencing confusion episodes was not a man capable of conducting a syndicate gathering with full strategic clarity. A man like that, appearing at a meeting, would look exactly like what Dorian wanted to look like. A compromised leader making a desperate play. On Sunday, Mara watched Dr. Voss from the corridor outside the records room. 2 a.m. She had positioned herself in the service alcove, 20 feet down the hall, not hiding exactly, just occupying a space that no one would think to examine, with her back against the wall and her breathing slow and mind working through the next 4 days. Voss came out of the records room at 4:11. She walked back toward the east wing, with the precise, contained movement of a woman, holding something carefully inside herself. Her face was neutral, professional. Mara watched the line of her shoulders and thought about what it cost a person to do what Voss was doing, the specific internal architecture required to maintain clinical competence while feeding your patients. Location intelligence to the man trying to kill him. She wondered if Voss had volunteered or been recruited. She wondered if Voss understood the full scope of what she was participating in, or if she'd been told a limited version, some story about a rival family member, an insurance investigation, a legal dispute, the kinds of framings that made a small betrayal feel justifiable before you understood. It wasn't small at all. It didn't change what needed to happen. But Mara noticed she was wondering. Monday arrived with a specific kind of pressure in the air that she recognized as the estate reconfiguring itself around an approaching event. The gathering was 4 days out. Dorian's consigliere, an older man named Bertrand, who handled the logistical arrangements for syndicate meetings, and who had been present at the estate for 2 days without Mara, previously understand why was coordinating with the security. Staff about venue, transport, and the particular protocols that governed what happened when regional syndicate leadership occupied the same space. She observed this from the periphery. She noted who Bertrand spoke to. She noted who he avoided. She noted that he and Calder had not been in the same room since Bertrand's arrival, which was unusual for a logistics process that would normally require the senior lieutenant's sign-off on security arrangements. She brought this to Dorian on Monday afternoon. He was out of bed. Not publicly to anyone outside the inner circle, he was still bedridden and deteriorating. But privately, in the room, he was standing at the window in a robe that looked less like the garment of a sick man than it had a week ago. The color was back in his face in a way that changed the geometry of his features. He was still weaker than his baseline. She could see it in the way he held the windowsill, the slight extra pressure of the grip. But he was standing. "Bertrand is avoiding Calder," she said. Dorian didn't turn from the window. "Bertrand has been avoiding Calder for 6 months, he said. "He hasn't told me why, did you ask? Bertrand tells me things when he's ready." A pause. "It's one of the reasons I've kept him for 30 years. He might be ready now," Mara said. "Or he might not be, and we don't have time to wait for ready." Dorian turned from the window, looked at her, with the full weight of his attention, which was a considerable thing. "You want me to push him? I want someone to ask him directly what he knows about Calder and what he's been sitting on and why." She held his gaze. "Trust him. He knows you trust him. If there's something, because he wasn't protecting you from knowing, and you give him the opening, he'll take it," Dorian said, quietly. Something moved across his face that she couldn't read. "Set it up." Tonight. She arranged it the way she arranged everything now, invisibly, through the logistics of the house, rather than through any direct communication that could be observed. She made sure Bertrand's dinner tray included the specific brandy that Dorian served when he wanted a private conversation. She made sure the security rotation that evening left the corridor outside Dorian's room with a 15-minute window. She did not attend the meeting. She didn't need to. What she learned, from Victor, who had been told by Dorian the following morning, changed the shape of everything. Bertrand had been watching Calder for 8 months. He had seen, in that time, a pattern of contact between Calder and a logistics company that appeared legitimate on paper, but whose shipping routes, when mapped against the syndicate's own operational territory, traced paths that should not have existed. Company moved goods through 3 ports. 2 of those ports fell within Varick's coastal operation. The third was a neutral corridor that both syndicates used a gray zone, technically, but the specific documentation on the shipments showed approval codes that came from Varick's network, not Kessler's. Calder had been routing syndicate operational intelligence through Varick's shipping infrastructure. Receipts, shipment manifests, route confirmations, all of it carrying a secondary data layer that, if you knew how to read it, was a map of Dorian's organizational structure, its personnel, its assets, its vulnerabilities. He had been doing it for 8 months, which meant Varick hadn't just planned the poisoning. He had spent 8 months building a complete picture of what he was taking over before he made his move. Mara sat with this in the security office on Tuesday morning and felt something cold and very clear settle into the center of her chest. 8 months. Pete had been in the house for 14. Poisoning had begun 6 weeks ago. The timeline described a patience that was genuinely frightening, a man who had decided to acquire something and had spent the better part of a year learning exactly how it worked before he touched it. There's more, Victor said. He was standing, not sitting. He'd been standing since he started telling her, which meant his body hadn't been able to settle into the information. The shipping records Bertrand found. He had them analyzed by someone he trusts outside the organization. And the data layer in those shipments included Dorian's medical records, his medications, his dosage history. Victor's voice was flat in the way that it got when he was controlling something significant. Varick knew what Dorian was taking. He knew the statin dosage. He designed the grapefruit protocol specifically. The room was very quiet. Gareth didn't figure that out himself, Mara said. She had known this in the abstract since the beginning. But the specificity of it, that Varick had obtained Dorian's medical records and reverse-engineered a poisoning from them, was different from knowing it in the abstract. Gareth was given a protocol, Victor said, a recipe. Quantities, timing, duration. He was told it was a supplement that would help with the statin side effects. He was told Dorian had approved it. A pause. He might actually have believed that, or he might be lying. We're still talking to Gareth. The way Victor said still talking had specific texture. Pete is contained. Victor's jaw moved. He hasn't been arrested. He doesn't know he's contained. He thinks he's still operational. Mara looked at him. What does contained mean exactly? It means he's under observation every minute of every day, and his communication channels are being monitored, and anything he sends or receives goes through us first. A beat. He's been told there's a change of plans, and to sit tight until Thursday. You told him that. Someone told him that. Through the channel he uses. Victor met her eyes. Varick's side thinks their asset is still functional. Absorbed this. The layers of the thing. The fake medical data flowing to Voss, flowing to Varick. The fake operational status flowing from Pete's channel. Dorian performing deterioration while actually standing at his window. It was a controlled deception running in multiple directions simultaneously, and it would hold exactly as long as no single element failed. We need the gathering to move fast, she said. Once Varick is in that room and the exposure happens, his people on the outside are going to start getting information that doesn't match what they've been told. We have a window. Dorian knows, Victor said. The gathering is 2 days. Tuesday collapsed into Wednesday in the specific way that countdown days did, simultaneously too slow and too fast, each hour containing more operational detail than it could comfortably hold. Mara moved through the house with an attentiveness that had sharpened past what she'd thought was her ceiling. She checked the data in the records room to confirm Voss had read the updated files. She checked the kitchen to confirm the produced channel was still carrying the controlled messaging. She checked Calder's behavior, which had in the past 4 days become something she could only describe as coiled the specific physical quality of a man who had moved past anxiety into the compressed readiness of someone who believed an outcome was imminent. Calder thought Dorian was running out of time. She found this both useful and Keynesian measure, which was becoming a familiar pairing. Wednesday evening, 6 hours before the gathering, she was in the East Wing, replacing the spent medical supply containers, still doing this, still maintaining the cover of routine, when she heard voices from the records room that should have been empty. Stopped. The voices were low, but not quiet enough for the corridor's acoustics, which she knew well. 2 voices. She recognized one immediately, Dr. Voss. The other voice she did not recognize. Male speaking quietly, slightly accented, in a way she couldn't place at first distance. She moved to the alcove position, back flat, breathing minimal, and listened. Caught fragments. Thursday confirms. Told them it's stable. And then Voss's voice, tighter than its professional register, riskier than you said it would be. If Prath notices the access times. And then the male voice again, clearer for a moment. Varric says one more reading. That's all. Mara's hands were perfectly still at her sides. Did not move. She stood in the alcove, while the voice she didn't recognize said Varric's name out loud, in an estate quarter 6 hours before the gathering, where Dorian intended to expose everything. The meeting in the records room lasted 4 more minutes. When it ended, she heard one set of footsteps leave Voss, heading toward the East Wing quarters, and then silence. The second person did not leave through the corridor. Counted to 30. Then she moved to the records room doorway and looked in. Empty. The room had one window, narrow, service level, ground floor. The latch was not fully closed. Someone had come in through the window. Someone who was not a member of the medical team, not a member of the estate staff, not on any access log because they hadn't used the door. Someone who had been inside the estate grounds without authorization. She went directly to Victor. He was in the security office, and he read her face before she said a word, and had his earpiece in before she finished the first sentence. Someone was inside the perimeter, she said. Records room window. They met with Voss in person. Victor was already pulling up the external camera feeds. When? 20 minutes ago. I don't know how long they'd been here. The camera feeds showed the estate grounds in their nighttime configuration. Motion-sensitive, high-resolution, covering all standard entry points. Victor pulled up the eastern grounds, the area adjacent to the records room window, and scrolled back 25 minutes. Nothing on the standard feeds. He pulled up the maintenance cameras, the secondary system, lower resolution, covering the utility corridors and the outer service perimeter. Scrolled back. There. Figure moving along the eastern fence line in the maintenance corridor, blind spot the specific gap in coverage that the security team knew about and had noted for repair in a report that was 4 months old and had not been acted on. Moving with the deliberate, calibrated precision of someone who had studied the coverage map. They knew the gap, Victor said. Varric's people have Calder's intelligence, Mara said. Calder had the security schematics. Victor stood up. His voice, when he spoke into his earpiece, was the quietest and most frightening version of itself. He gave 3 instructions, each one. Sentence. She watched Waldschutz Delterket while I did it, and saw the thing she'd been watching for the moment when Victor Hale stopped managing the situation and started ending it. We can't move on them tonight, she said. Not 6 hours out. He looked at her. The look lasted a long time. I know, he said. They know someone saw the window. Or they will, if Voss tells them. Will Voss tell them? She might not have a way to. He pulled up Voss's room on the interior cameras. She was in it, sitting on the edge of her bed, still dressed, with her hands folded in her lap in the posture of someone enduring something. She doesn't have a phone on record other than the one we have the number for. And that one's been silent. She might have another. She might. He was quiet for a moment. I'm going to need to talk to her. Not tonight, Mara said. Tonight you need her to believe nothing has changed. If she panics before the gathering, she tells Varric, and Varric arrives prepared instead of comfortable. Victor's expression said what his voice didn't, which was that he didn't like any of this, and understood why it was necessary. 6 hours, Mara said. 6 hours, he agreed. She went back to her room and did not sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed, with her shoes on and her jacket on, and her mind moving through the gathering shape as she understood it, a room full of regional syndicate leadership, Dorian appearing compromised, Varric believing he was watching the beginning of an ending. Plan was to let Varric's confidence build through the early part of the meeting, then produce the evidence, Calder's shipping records, Bertrand's analysis, the medical data trail in front of the assembled leadership. Public exposure, undeniable. But someone had been inside the perimeter tonight. Someone had met Voss in person, which meant the channel of communication was more sophisticated than a produce truck and a kitchen drawer, which meant Varric had more assets in play than Pete and Calder and Voss, which meant the gathering room was not going to be controlled space. There were going to be people in it who were not what they appeared to be. She thought about this for a long time. Then she got up, went to the desk, and began going through the gathering's guest list from memory. 12 regional leaders, each attending with one aide. 2 of Dorian's own senior staff as hosts. Bertrand. Victor Calder, who did not yet know he was going to be exposed. 28 people in a room. She started mapping the ones she didn't know. By 4 in the morning, she had 2 names she couldn't fully account for. One aide whose background documentation was thinner than it should have been for a person claiming the level of organizational seniority that would justify their principal's attendance. And one regional leader, a man named Harwick, attending for the first time in 3 years, his previous absence attributed to health whose re-entry into the gathering circuit happened when coincide with the period of Varric's strategic expansion into contested territory. She didn't have proof. She had pattern and proximity, which was all she'd ever had, and which had been enough before. She was at Victor's door at 4:15. He opened it before she knocked, which was either instinct or he'd been watching his own hallway cameras, and she told him about the 2 names. He listened. He said, "Harwick's aide. Yes, I know the name." His voice had gone to the flat register. "Cleared him." She waited. "I cleared him 6 weeks ago," Victor said. Before we knew any of this, he looked at her, and in his face was the specific expression of a man who had just understood the scope of his own blind spot. His background documentation came through Calder's office. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the silence of a structure revealing a crack that had been there longer than anyone had looked. "Victor," she said, "I know. If Harwick's aide is Varric's, I know." His voice was tight in a way it never was. "I know what it means. It meant the exposure wasn't going to go the way they'd planned. It meant Varric hadn't come to the gathering to be caught. It meant he'd come prepared for the possibility of exposure and had positioned a response inside the room. And it meant that Dorian Kessler, weakened and still recovering, was about to walk into a room where at least one person was positioned to act on Varric's behalf if the situation moved against him. She looked at Victor. He looked at her. The gathering was in less than 2 hours. "We can't cancel," she said. "If we cancel, Varric knows we know. He goes to ground. He changes everything, and we lose whatever window we had. We can't walk Dorian into a room with a weapon pointed at him." "We don't know it's a weapon," she said. "We know it's a person. Person can be managed. How?" She thought about the room's geometry, about what she knew and what Varric didn't know she knew, about the specific advantage of a person who moved through spaces without being noticed, who carried a cleaning caddy as armor, who had spent 11 months learning exactly how this house and the people in it worked. "Put me in the room," she said. "Not as staff, not as anything visible. Put me in the room, in the one position where no one will question why I'm there." Victor looked at her. "You're not trained." For neither was Varric when he planned a poisoning, she said. He just paid attention to the right details. She held his gaze. "I know where Harwick's aide is going to stand. I know the entry points. I know how the room flows, and I know what Varric looks like when something is about to go wrong, because I've been watching people in this house manage their fear for 11 months. Victor was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she could hear the estate beginning to staff movements, the distant sound of kitchen preparation, the first light changing the color of the windows. "There's one more thing," he said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard before. Something careful in it, something that meant the next sentence had been carried for a while. Bertrand's analysis of the shipping records, the financial layer. She waited. The accounts Calder was routing through Varick's infrastructure, Victor said. The money that moved through them, over 8 months, some of it was operational funds. But there was a secondary account, smaller, consistent deposits. He stopped, started again. The deposits came from a holding company registered 18 months ago. He looked at her directly. The holding company's registered agent is a woman named Mara Bellamy. The floor did not move. The walls did not move. Everything was perfectly still. Her name, in Varick's financial architecture. 18 months ago, 3 before, she had applied for the housekeeper position at the Kessler estate. She heard her own breathing change, heard it go slightly faster, and then, through conscious effort that cost her something. Steady again. That's not possible, she said. I know, Victor said. That's what I told Bertrand. My name on a holding company, I've never. She stopped, made herself think. Not react. Think. Someone registered a company in my name before I came here. Before you applied here, Victor said. Which means she stopped again. The shape of it was assembling itself, and she didn't want it to finish assembling because of what it meant. Someone knew I was going to be here. Someone set me up as a fallback position. If the operation was ever exposed, you'd be in the paper trail, Victor said. A housekeeper, with no apparent connection to anything, whose name is on an account that funded the operation, who had access to the estate, who was present during Dorian's illness. His jaw was tight. You'd look exactly like the asset. She stood with this. The room was very still. Does Dorian know? She said. I told him an hour ago. What did he say? Easy. Victor looked at her with an expression she couldn't read and had never seen on his face before. He said, ask her. She took a breath, took another. Outside, the sky was the pale gray of approaching morning, and somewhere in the estate, 26 people were preparing to gather in a room where Silas Varick intended to finish what he'd started, and where Mara Bellamy's name was now written into the evidence in a way that made her look like she had built all of this herself. She had 7 minutes before the first guests arrived. She had 7 minutes, and she used none of them standing still. Victor, she said. The holding company. What's the registered address? A mail forwarding service in the city. Commercial address. No physical presence. Who registered it? What name is on the agent filing beyond mine? Filing agent is listed as a law firm. Harwick and Associates. Harwick, the regional leader who hadn't attended a gathering in 3 years, whose aide had background documentation that came through Calder's office, whose name was now on both ends of the financial architecture that had been built to frame her. It's not a coincidence, she said. No, Varick didn't just plan the poisoning. He planned the cleanup. She felt the pieces lock into place, with the specific cold clarity that came when a pattern finished revealing itself. If anything went wrong, if the poisoning was discovered, if Calder was exposed, I'm the asset on paper. The housekeeper, who was positioned here 18 months in advance, whose name is on the funding account, who had access to everything. You'd take the fall, Victor said. I'd take the fall. Varick distances himself. Calder claims he was manipulated by someone he didn't know, was connected to a rival operation, and the whole thing gets reframed as an inside job by a planted domestic worker. She heard her own voice say it with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. It's elegant. It's not going to hold, Victor said. Dorian needs to hear it from me directly, right now, before that room fills up. She was already moving toward the door. And then I need 5 minutes with Bertrand. Dorian was dressed. Not in the robe, not in the costume of illness dressed, in the dark suit he apparently wore to syndicate gatherings, which fit him with the particular precision of a garment that had been made for him when he was at his full physical weight, and which now hung with a subtle looseness that she hoped, in the room's lighting, would read as the carriage of a man, rather than the hollowness of one still recovering. He was standing at the window again, the same window, and when she came in, he turned and looked at her, with the expression that meant he already knew what she was going to say, because Victor had told him, and he had been waiting for her to come, say it herself. The holding company, she said. Yes, I need you to know that I have never. I know, he said. It was not a performance of belief. It was flat and simple, and left no room for the conversation she had been preparing. I know you didn't. He paused. Sit down. I don't have time to sit down. Then stand. He came away from the window, moving carefully, the deliberate movement of a man managing a body that was cooperating but not fully, who had made a decision about what he was going to ask it to do today and was not going to revisit that decision. The holding company puts you in the frame. That means when I expose Varric in that room, his response is going to be to point at you. Yes, which means we need to expose the frame at the same time we expose the operation. His eyes were steady. Bertrand has the full documentation. Bertrand has the shipping records, the financial layer, the sequence of Calder's approvals. What he doesn't have, what nobody has yet on paper, is the connection between the holding company and Harwick's law firm. That connection exists, but it needs to be pulled from the filing records directly, and it needs to happen. In the next she checked the window, the light, 4 minutes. Dorian looked at her. Can it be done? I can do it from the security system if Victor gives me access to the external registry query. She was already calculating. 2 minutes to pull the filing. 2 minutes to print and get it to Bertrand before the room opens. Then go, Dorian said. Go now, she went. She covered the distance between Dorian's room and the security office at a pace that was not quite running, only because running in the corridors of Dorian Kessler's estate on the morning of a syndicate gathering would have been visible to every camera and every early arriving security staff member, and visible was the one thing she could not afford to be right now. She walked fast, turned corners tight, and was at Victor's terminal in 90 seconds. Victor was already logged in. He stepped back from the keyboard without being asked. She pulled up the state business registry, entered the holding company name, navigated to the filing history, found the registered agent law firm, cross-referenced it against the Bar Association directory, and there it was, Harwick and Associates, registered 26 months ago, principal attorney listed as one Gerald Harwick, same surname as the regional leader who hadn't attended a gathering in 3 years, because he had spent those 3 years building the administrative infrastructure of Varric's expansion, while maintaining the cover of a legitimate syndicate affiliate. Same name, same firm. On both ends of the money, she printed it. The printer was the older model in the corner that still made a mechanical sound when it worked, and the sound of it in the quiet office was very loud. She pulled the page before it finished cooling, folded it once, and went to find Bertrand. Bertrand was in the east corridor with a checklist and a radio, managing the final setup for the gathering room with the unhurried precision of a man who had done this for 30 years, and had developed a specific immune response to last-minute chaos. He looked up when she appeared, took in her expression, and held out his hand without being asked. She gave him the page. He read it. His face did not change, but something behind it did a settling, like a picture being straightened on a wall. When did you find this? 3 minutes ago. He folded the page and tucked it inside his jacket. It completes the chain. Yes, you have everything you need now. I have everything Dorian needs, Bertrand said, with a precision that was its own kind of elegance. He looked at her for a moment. You should know something. The 2 men Varric sent the aid, and whoever came through the window last night, they're not here for the exposure. They're here in case the exposure happens. She felt her pulse adjust. A contingency, he confirmed. Varric is not naive. He knows there is some probability that this gathering goes badly for him. He has prepared a response to that probability. Bertrand's eyes were steady and very old, in the way that came from having seen many things that could not be unseen. Response is not an exit. It is an escalation. She thought about what that meant in a room with 26 people. He'd rather burn it down than lose it clean. That has always been Varric's preference, Bertrand said. Dorian knows this. Victor knows this. Now you know this. He straightened his jacket. Stay close to the room. Not in it, close to it. You'll know when. She didn't ask when what. She understood. The gathering room in the Kessler estate was the formal dining room converted for operational use, a long table, 12 chairs to a sideboard along the eastern wall, that today held water and nothing else. The windows were covered with the heavy drapes used for security-sensitive meetings. The light came from the overhead fixtures, warm and directional, designed to make the room feel controlled and contained. She took her position in the service corridor that ran parallel to the dining room's eastern wall. There was a service door used for catering, for tray delivery, for all the invisible logistics of hospitality that opened into the room at the far end. She had her cleaning caddy with her. It was not a prop anymore. It was cover, and it was also the only thing currently available in this corridor that had any kind of weight to it, and she was keeping her options open. She listened to the room fill through the wall. The acoustic quality of the service corridor was not perfect. She caught maybe 60% of what was said at conversational volume, more when voices rose. She had been learning this corridor for 11 months. She knew which sections of wall were thinner, which spots amplified certain frequencies. She positioned herself at the thinnest section, 6 feet from the service door, and listened. Greetings. The specific register of powerful men acknowledging each other with precisely calibrated warmth enough to signal respect, not enough to signal vulnerability. She heard Calder's voice, the composed social version of it, working the room with the particular energy of a man who was managing a significant internal state and doing it well enough that anyone who wasn't specifically listening for it would miss the management entirely. She was specifically listening for it. She could hear the seam. She heard Dorian enter the room. She knew his entrance by the change in the room's sound, the slight drop in ambient conversation, the fractional reorganization of attention that happened when the person everyone was actually there to see arrived. He spoke briefly. She caught the cadence rather than the words controlled, measured with a deliberate roughness at the edges that would read as illness-related weakness to anyone who didn't know him. He was performing precisely what they'd planned. Diminished, present but fraying. A man making an appearance he should probably not have made. The meeting opened. Bertrand handled the procedural elements. There was always a procedural element to these. She'd learned a formalization that served the function of establishing shared ground before anything substantive was discussed. She tuned through it, tracking the room's emotional temperature rather than its content. Varric spoke. She heard his voice for the first time, and it was not what she'd constructed in her head from second-hand information, quieter than she expected, measured. The voice of a man who had learned, at some point in his life, that quiet voices made other people lean in, and that people who leaned in gave ground without knowing they'd done it. He asked, after Dorian's health with an expression of concern, that she could hear the architecture of it through the wall, the specific tonal choices that made concern sound genuine while leaving the speaker's position entirely intact. Dorian responded. She caught it, better than some people would prefer. A laugh from the room. The ambiguous kind people deciding simultaneously whether that was a joke or something else. The meeting moved. She tracked it through the wall, feeling the shape of it shift as Bertrand began the financial review standard quarterly content, the kind of thing that provided cover for the actual intelligence being embedded in it. She knew the moment was coming. She had been calibrated to it for days. What she had not been calibrated for was what happened 17 minutes into the meeting. The service door at the far end of the corridor opened, not her end. The far end, 12 feet away. The door that connected the corridor to the kitchen passage rather than to the gathering room. She heard it open and turned, and saw a figure step through it and stop. Harwick's aide. He was younger than she'd expected from the documentation, late 20s, with the specific compact build of someone who trained for utility rather than appearance, and eyes that scanned the corridor in the practiced, overlapping pattern of someone who had been taught to clear a space. He saw her in the same moment she fully processed him. They looked at each other for a fraction of a second that contained an entire assessment. He moved first, not toward her, toward the service door into the gathering room. He had something in his right hand, held low and close to his thigh, and in the corridor's warm light she could see. It was not a weapon in the conventional sense. It was a device, small, flat, with a recessed button on the face. She recognized the form factor from the estate's own communications infrastructure, a signal device, the kind used to trigger pre-positioned equipment remotely. He was going to open that door and use that device inside the gathering room. She did not think about it. There was no time to think about it, and thinking was not what the next 2 seconds required. She picked up the cleaning caddy by its handle and threw it, not at him at the door. The caddy hit the service door 2 feet in front of him with a crash of bottles and metal that was loud enough to be heard through the wall. loud enough to startle him sideways, loud enough to change the geometry of the corridor for the 1 second she needed. She was moving before the caddy landed, covering the 12 feet between them in the time it took him to recover his balance. And when she reached him, his right arm was coming up, and she grabbed his wrist with both hands and turned it in the direction. A wrist was not designed to go. He made a sound, short and guttural. The device left his hand. She didn't let go of his wrist. She put her weight into it and drove him sideways into the corridor wall with enough force that his shoulder hit the plaster, and she felt the impact travel through her own hands and arms and into her shoulders in a way that was going to produce specific pain in about an hour if she was still around to feel it. He was stronger than her. He was trained in ways she was not. But she had 2 hands on one of his, and she had position, and she had the wall, and she kept his arm bent at the angle that was causing him pain. And she used the pain to keep him against the wall, and she looked at his face at a distance of approximately 8 inches, and said quietly, "Don't." He looked back at her. His breathing was fast, and his jaw was tight, and she could see him calculating, running the numbers on whether he could take her with one functional arm, and the answer in his eyes was not confident, which was the only answer she needed. The service door from the gathering room opened. Victor came through it at speed, took in the corridor, took in the 2 of them against the wall, and crossed the remaining distance in 3 steps. He had the aid's free arm before the man could recalibrate. Victor said one word, "Down." The aide went down. Victor managed this with the efficiency of a man who had done it before and found it neither satisfying nor troubling, simply necessary. He zip-tied the aide's wrists with something he'd apparently had in his jacket pocket, which told Mara that Victor had anticipated this possibility more specifically than he'd let on. Picked up the device from the floor, looked at it. "Signal trigger," she said. "For what?" She thought about the window in the records room. The person who had come in through it, the person who was not on any log and had not come in through any door. Something pre-positioned, she said, on the grounds, or inside. Victor's face went through something fast and ugly. He spoke into his earpiece. She heard him say, "Sweep the east wing," and then say it again with a specific emphasis that meant now and not the casual version of now. He looked at her. "The room," he said. "Dorian needs you in the room." Now she went through the service door. The gathering room was 15 seconds into the exposure. She understood this the moment she stepped through the door, because the room's temperature had changed completely. The controlled social warmth was gone, replaced by the specific atmosphere of a space where something's true had just been said out loud, and everyone present was deciding in real time how to respond to it. Dorian was standing. He should not have been standing. A man in his condition, by the performance they'd planned, should have been seated, but he was standing at the head of the table with Bertrand beside him. And on the table in front of each place setting was a document. Financial chain, the shipping records, the Harwick connection, distributed while the meeting was in procedural mode, before anyone had understood what they were holding. Now they understood. Calder Ross was on his feet at the far end of the table. Face had done something she had not seen it do. In 11 months of observation, it had lost its management. The social surface was gone, and what was underneath it was not calculated. It was fear moving fast towards something harder than fear. Varric was still seated. This was the thing that she registered first and processed immediately. Silas Varric, at the moment of exposure, with every eye in the room, moving between him and Dorian and the documents in front of them, still seated. Hands flat on the table, expression composed in the specific way that composure became a kind of aggression, the refusal to react as a power statement. He was waiting for the device to trigger. He was waiting for whatever his aid had been sent to activate, and it had not activated, and she watched him understand, in the space of a breath, that it was not going to activate. Something moved through his face. Too fast and too controlled for most people in the room to catch it. But she was watching specifically for it, and she caught it, the recalculation. The very brief moment of a man revising his plan in real time, closing one door, opening another. His hand moved to his jacket lapel. She saw it and moved, before she understood why she was moving, before the intellectual process of weapon assessment had completed, because her body had been reading this room for 60 seconds, and her body knew what that hand movement meant before her mind finished the sentence. She crossed the room in 6 steps. Crystal pitcher on the sideboard was in her hand, without a specific decision to pick it up, cold and heavy, and when Varric's hand came out of his jacket, she brought the pitcher down on his forearm with the full force of her forward momentum. The sound was wrong, not the sound of crystal on flesh, but of crystal on something harder, and the object that dropped from Varric's hand onto the table was small and metal, and not a conventional firearm. It was a second signal device, identical to the one the aide had carried. 2 triggers, 2 pre-positioned responses. The room had erupted, not into violence, into the controlled chaos of 23 people, all processing the same information at the same speed and responding according to their individual threat assessments. Chairs moved. Voices overlapped. Victor's security staff came through the main doors at the far end in the specific organized way that Victor had arranged them, and the organization of it cut through the chaos faster than any individual voice could have. Varric was looking at her. His forearm was against the table, and she was standing 2 feet from him with the pitcher in her hand, and her breathing was fast. And her heart was a physical presence in her chest. In a way, it was not usually, and Varric was looking at her with an expression that was not anger. It was the expression of a man who had just identified the variable he had failed to account for. "You're the housekeeper," he said. His voice was completely level. "I was," she said. His eyes moved to the document in front of his place setting. To the Harwick connection, his own law firm's name on his own financial architecture sitting on the table in front of him in a room full of witnesses. His eyes came back to her face. "The holding company," he said, "is on that page," she said, "along with everything else." He was quiet for a moment. In the room around them, the security staff had called her. Had the situation contained to the degree that it could be contained in a space that had just experienced the equivalent of a controlled detonation? Dorian was still standing at the head of the table, and the effort of it was visible now. The grip on the table edge, the set of his jaw, but he was standing, and every person in this room could see that he was standing. "You have 2 devices," Mara said quietly, so that only Varric heard her. "One didn't trigger. This one didn't trigger. Whatever you pre-positioned, it's been swept." This was a gamble. She did not know for certain that the sweep had found everything, but she needed him to believe it, and she needed him to believe it right now, before he found another option. Varric looked at her for a long time. She did not look away. "Smart," he said finally. 1 word. He said it without inflection, which made it a pure assessment, rather than a compliment, and pure assessment from a man like Silas Varric was, in its way, the most honest thing she had heard in this room all day. "Dorian," she said, without raising her voice. Dorian looked at her from the head of the table. She held up the device she'd taken from the aide in the corridor. He understood what she was showing him. "Victor," Dorian said. And then, because the moment called for it, because 23 witnesses needed to see what the conclusion of this looked like, Dorian Kessler let go of the table edge and stood without support in front of every regional leader in the room. And the looseness in his suit was not weakness. And everyone present understood it was not weakness. And he said, "This meeting is concluded. Mr. Varric will remain." Calder was removed. Harwick was removed. The room emptied with the specific ordered urgency of people who understood that their presence was no longer required, and that staying would constitute a choice about which side they were on, and no one in that room wanted to make that choice today. When the last of them were gone, the room held 4 people, Dorian, Victor, Mara, and Silas Varric, still seated, hands flat on the table, with the document in front of him that described everything he had built and everything he had lost. Victor had his phone out. Mara could see from where she stood that he was running something financial queries, account access, the kind of operational moves that happened fast when there was a window, and the window was measured in minutes. Varric looked at Dorian. "You were supposed to be dead," he said. Not accusatory, observational. The voice of a man reviewing a project's failure with professional detachment. "I know," Dorian said. The grapefruit protocol was sound. It was, Dorian agreed. She found it. Varric looked at Mara. She was still holding the crystal pitcher. She set it down on the sideboard with a care that was not steadiness exactly, more like the controlled execution of a deliberate action. Her hands were not shaking. She was slightly surprised by this. "The housekeeper," Varric said again. "Former," Dorian said. Varric's eyes moved between them. Something shifted in them, not defeat exactly, more like a man updating a database, filing a correction. "The holding company was supposed to be the exit," he said. "If everything else failed, you'd be looking at her." "I know," Dorian said. "She told me about it herself." Varric looked at her again. "You found your own name in my records." "Victor found it," she said. "I just figured out what it meant." Silence. Varric looked at the document again. At the Harwick name, his own family name, at the bottom of the chain. He looked at it with the expression of a man who had built something over a long time and was seeing in it clearly for the first time from the outside. "What happens now?" he said. It was not a question. Victor looked up from his phone. "Now," he said, "we talk about Julian." Varric's expression changed. The first genuine, unmanaged change. She had seen in his face a flash of something that was not fear, but was close to it, quickly covered. His nephew's name, said in that flat voice. "In this room, with these documents on the table." "Julian doesn't know about any of this," Varric said. Beat of it was telling. "Julian knows about the estate," Victor said. "Julian knows about the accounts. Julian has been operational in the coastal network for 8 months. He set his phone on the table, screen up, showing a transaction record. Julian moved money 3 days ago, from an account you don't control, in a direction you didn't authorize." Varric's jaw tightened. The very first physical tell she had seen from him, and it was enough. "Your nephew," Dorian said quietly, "has been preparing his own exit from your organization for 6 months. And when your operation here failed, which it has, Julian was positioned to take the network in the transition." A pause. Not for you. For himself, the room was very quiet. Varric looked at the table, at his own hands, flat on the surface, the posture he'd maintained since he sat down as a form of control, now looking like something else. The posture of a man who had nothing left to reach for. Victor's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. His expression shifted, the machine finding a seam again. The second time she'd seen it in 2 days, and the second time it meant something bad. "Julian's moving," Victor said. "What does that mean?" she said. Victor looked up. "It means he just activated the estate's external security override." He looked at Dorian. Someone gave him the code. Calder, she thought. Calder, who had been in the house for 16 years, and who had signed documents and managed timelines, and who, in being removed from the gathering 20 minutes ago, had apparently had enough time to make one phone call. The lights in the gathering room flickered once. Then the room went dark. Not dim dark, the full window drapes, the interior fixtures, the emergency backup that should have kicked in and didn't, because the external security override had cut the grid at the estate level. Total darkness, except for the thin edge of daylight coming through the gap at the bottom of the drapes on the eastern wall. She heard Victor move immediately, the sound of him crossing the room toward Dorian, sure-footed in the dark, in a way that spoke to a man who had planned for this contingency. She heard the main doors at the far end of the gathering room open. Not the security staff. The security staff would have knocked. The security staff would have called out. The doors opened, and no one called out. And in the darkness, she heard footsteps, multiple, organized, moving with the specific rhythm of people who had entered a space they intended to control. Julian had arrived. She was still standing near the sideboard. In her hand, without having consciously picked it up again, was the crystal pitcher. Put it down. It would not be enough for what was coming through those doors. She looked at the thin line of daylight at the bottom of the eastern drapes and thought about the window behind them. Thought about what was on the other side of that window. Thought about the geography of the estate grounds and where Julian's people would be positioned and where they would not be. And she thought about what she had in this room that Julian did not know she had, which was the knowledge that the signal devices had not worked, and that whatever Julian believed was prepositioned for him inside this estate was already gone. He was coming in blind. She just needed to make sure he stayed that way long enough for what she already knew to become the weapon that ended this before it became the thing she was afraid it was about to become. She moved toward the eastern wall in the dark, her hand trailing the sideboard surface for orientation, counting steps, and when she reached the drapes, she pushed them aside, and the daylight came in, gray and sudden, and she looked out the window at the estate grounds, and saw exactly what she'd hoped not to see, and exactly what she'd known she would see, and she turned back to the dark room and said, in a voice that was steady, because it had to be, "There are 6 of them on the grounds, and 2 already inside, and Julian is one of the 2 inside, and Dorian," she stopped, found the shape of him in the gray light coming through the window, found Victor beside him. "I know how to finish this without anyone dying in this room. But I need 30 seconds, and I need you to trust me." Dorian's voice came back out of the dark, and it was the steadiest thing in the room, steadier than the walls. "You have it. 30 seconds. She used the first 5 crossing to the sideboard, in the gray light from the window, her hand finding the surface by memory, fingers moving along it, until they found what she was looking for, the water service. 2 full carafes, 3 glasses, a small tray. She took 1 carafe, heavy, solid glass, thick enough to matter. She used the next 5 getting to Victor, close enough to speak directly into his ear, without raising her voice, above a breath. "The financials access you were running when the lights went out. Still live?" "Yes. Julian's accounts. The ones he moved money from 3 days ago. Can you freeze them from here?" A pause. 3 seconds. "If the estate network is still routing through the external override, I might be able to piggyback the financial access on a different channel." "Do it," she said. "All of them. Every account connected to the coastal network. Freeze everything. That'll take longer than 30 seconds. Then start now. And don't stop." She turned from him, found Dorian's shape in the gray. "Stay at the window. Stay in the light. I need Julian to see you." Dorian said nothing. She heard him move toward the window. She used the remaining time getting to the far end of the room, to the wall beside the main doors, pressing herself flat against the plaster, 6 inches from where the doors stood open into the darkness of the main corridor beyond. She could hear them, now 2 sets of footsteps in the main corridor moving without hurry, the unhurried pace of men who believed they controlled the environment they were entering. Julian and 1 other. She could not see them. The corridor was deeper dark than the room, but she could hear the difference between them. Julian's footsteps were slightly heavier, more deliberate, the footsteps of a man accustomed to entering spaces as a statement. The second set was quieter, offset a step behind, and to the left, which was the position of a person functioning as cover rather than leadership. She knew where they were going to be when they crossed the threshold. She knew because she had spent 11 months learning how this room's geometry worked, where people positioned themselves when they entered it from those doors. The specific gravitational pull of the long table and the window and the head of the table where Dorian was now visible in the gray daylight, standing, waiting. Julian was going to see Dorian at the window and move toward the table. That was where he was going to be. She waited. Julian Varick crossed the threshold 2 feet in front of her, and she saw him clearly for the first time, younger than she'd expected, though she didn't know why she'd expected older. Late 30s, with the kind of build that came from considered effort, and a face that, in a different context, might have been called handsome. But in this context was simply the face of a man who had decided something and not yet been told he was wrong about it. He had something in his hand. She could see it in the edge of the daylight from the window, a phone, not a weapon, held up in front of him like a remote control. He was looking at Dorian. "You should be dead," Julian said. He said it the same way his uncle had said it, which told her something about the Varick family's relationship with the gap between planning and reality. They treated it as a technical error rather than a fundamental one. "People keep telling me that," Dorian said. Julian's thumb moved toward the phone screen. "I have the estate's external systems on this device. Security, power, communications, you're isolated." "I know," Dorian said. "The signal devices your people found, those were distractions. The real leverage is financial." Julian's voice had the specific quality of a man delivering a prepared statement. He had practiced this. He had imagined this moment and practiced for it, which meant he was slightly less present in the actual moment than he thought he was. "Your accounts have already been accessed. By morning, the Kessler Network's liquid assets will be in transit too." "They won't," Mara said. Julian turned. She was 6 feet from him, which was closer than he'd realized she was, and his body reacted before his composure caught up a slight backward shift, a tightening of the hand holding the phone. He looked at her, took her in. The woman standing in the darkness at the edge of the room's gray light, still in her jacket, no weapon visible, holding a glass carafe. "Who are you?" he said. Not a question. The phrasing of a man re-identifying something he'd dismissed. "Victor," she said at normal volume. From the far end of the room, Victor said, "Done." Julian's eyes went to his phone. She watched his face in real time as he read whatever the screen was showing him. Watched the prepared statement dissolve. Watched the practiced composure follow it. Watched what was underneath both of those things arrive in his expression, with the particular ugliness who has just understood that the thing he came to collect has been removed while he was standing in front of it. "That's not possible," he said. 17 accounts, Victor said. He was reading from his own phone, his voice carrying through the dark room with the flat, informational quality of a man reporting results rather than savoring them. Combined balance frozen at approximately 43 million, pending regulatory review. The flag went in 60 seconds ago under a financial crimes reporting provision. A pause. The flag has a co-signatory. Bertrand filed his documentation with the appropriate authority 20 minutes ago during the gathering. The moment the accounts were frozen, the documentation became part of an active investigation. Julian stared at the phone in his hand. Mara watched him process. It watched him move through the stages of a man whose architecture has just been dismantled in front of him, looking for the support beam that might still be standing. "My uncle," he said, "is in this room," Dorian said. "Has been in this room. You came to finish what he started, but your uncle's operation ended an hour ago." Julian turned. He hadn't realized. Varric was still there, hadn't seen his uncle in the far corner of the room, seated in the same position, hands flat on the table. The two men, it said, looked at each other across the dark room in the gray daylight from the window, and what passed between them was not the look of co-conspirators caught together, the look of two people who had been moving in the same direction from different starting points and had just discovered they were not, in fact, on the same side. "Varric," said Julian. "You said it was handled," Julian said. Practice quality was completely gone from his voice now. What was left was younger, rawer. "You said by Thursday it would be." "Sit down," Varric said. "The accounts are frozen." "Everything is sit down." The same two words, but the second time they had a weight that the first didn't. The weight of a man who had built something over a long time and was watching the person he'd intended to dismantle it in real time through impatience. Julian sat down. He sat down because the instructions still had that weight, even now. Even in a room full of evidence that the authority behind it no longer existed. Old architecture dies slowly. Mara set the carafe down on the table. She hadn't needed it. She set it down anyway. She set it down carefully anyway, because her hands needed something to do with the last of the adrenaline moving through them, and because the sound of glass meeting wood in the quiet room was grounding in a way she needed right now. She looked at Dorian. He was still at the window, still standing. The light from it was fully gray now, morning deepening into the kind of overcast that flattened everything and made distances hard to judge. And in that light, Dorian Kessler looked like a man who had spent the last several weeks being slowly killed and had decided not to cooperate with the process. "Victor," Dorian said, "call in." Victor made 3 calls in the next 90 seconds. Short, specific, using names she didn't recognize, and terminology she understood only in fragments. The result of those calls arrived at the estate in the next 20 minutes in the form of 3 vehicles and several individuals whose relationship to any official organization was deliberately ambiguous, but whose authority in this specific context was not. Julian was removed, quietly, with the same organized efficiency that had characterized Victor's management of the gathering. His aide, the man she had held against the corridor wall, was collected from where Victor's team had secured him. The 6 individuals on the estate grounds were addressed by the external security team, with a thoroughness that she stayed inside to avoid observing directly. Varric remained seated through all of it. When the room was empty except for the 4 of them, Dorian, Victor, Mara, and Varric and The gray morning light had shifted slightly towards something less flat. Varric looked at the document still in front of him on the table and said, "What do you want?" Dorian moved from the window to the table. He did not sit at the head. He sat one chair down, which put closer to Varric and at the same level, and she understood this as a deliberate choice, the kind of spatial decision that communicated something words would have overstated. He sat, and for a moment he just breathed, and she could see the cost of the last hour, in the set of his shoulders, not weakness, but expenditure. The body's account presented for payment. The coastal network, Dorian said. 3 ports. The shipping infrastructure. The personnel. Varric looked at him. "You spent 8 months building a map of my organization," Dorian said. "You know what it's worth. I know what the coastal operation is worth. We're going to discuss a transfer of operational control that makes the investigation Bertrand filed this morning an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe for both of us." Varric was quiet for a moment. "You're not going to hand me to the same people you called for Julian. I'm going to hand you to exactly the same people I called for Julian. If you don't give me a reason not to," Dorian said, "or we can have a different conversation." "The accounts are frozen." "The accounts are frozen," Dorian confirmed. "But accounts can be unfrozen by the same people who froze them. If the financial crimes documentation is withdrawn because the original complaint was determined to be based on incomplete information." He paused. "That determination requires a co-signatory. Bertrand will co-sign if I ask him to." Varric looked at Dorian for a long time. The assessment she'd seen in his eyes, since the moment he'd turned to look at her, in the darkened room, was still there, still running, still updating. "The network for the investigation," he said. "The network, the ports, the personnel files, and the account access codes for everything. Julian moved in the last 6 months without your authorization." Something shifted in Varric's face at the last part. The mention of Julian's independent operations. The 6 months of quiet repositioning his nephew had been doing inside the coastal network, while Varric focused on dismantling Kessler's. The particular expression of a man who had been betrayed from within while conducting his own betrayal, and who was only now, in this room, seeing the full symmetry of it. "Julian was going to take the coastal operation," Dorian said. "It was not gloating. It was information, delivered as information. Once I was gone and you were managing the transition, he was positioned to step in and frame the acquisition as his own work. You would have been the architect of someone else's empire." "I know," Varric said, quietly, with a flatness that meant he had known for some time, or had suspected, and had told himself he was wrong. "Then you understand why this offer is also in your interest." A long silence. Mara stood near the sideboard she had moved there without deciding to, the body's preference for something solid at her back, and watched Silas Varric make a decision. Watched him run the full calculation, the frozen accounts, the investigation documentation, Julian's betrayal, the 8 months of planning that had arrived at this room, with a housekeeper holding a carafe, and all of his contingencies neutralized. Watched him find the edge of the ledge he was standing on and measure the distance down. "All right," Varric said. The word landed in the room without drama. Just a word. The most consequential one spoken in the room all day, and also the quietest. Victor produced a phone. Varric provided the first account code. Process that followed was not fast. It took the better part of an hour, working through the financial architecture of the coastal network, layer by layer. Varric supplying codes and authorization sequences and contact protocols with the systematic cooperation of a man who had decided to be done with something. He did not perform reluctance. He did not try to withhold pieces. He went through it with the flat, professional completeness of the same man who had planned a poisoning from a medical file, methodical, thorough, unsentimentally precise. When it was finished, Varric sat back. He looked at the empty table in front of him. The documents gone, the phone gone, the evidence of the morning's work cleared into Victor's hands. And he looked like a man at the end of a long project, not defeated exactly, finished. There was a difference. "The housekeeper," he said, looking at Mara. "Former," she said. Again. It was becoming a kind of punctuation. "The holding company in your name," he said. "I'll provide the dissolution documentation." She looked at him. Why? Because it was a clean frame, and it should have worked. and it didn't, and leaving a dead piece of infrastructure in place is untidy. He said it with the matter-of-fact quality of a professional noting a cleanup requirement. Also, because you broke my arm. He looked at his forearm, which she could now see was swelling along the outer edge in the specific pattern of a fracture rather than a contusion. He had not mentioned it for the past 2 hours. He mentioned it now, with the same affect he'd used for everything else. She said, "I'll send for someone to look at that." "I'd appreciate it," he said. She found she had nothing further to say to Silas Varick, and he appeared to have nothing further to say to her. So she left the room and went into the corridor, and stood in it for a moment, with her back against the wall, and her eyes closed, and her breathing moving through a deliberate cycle that she had learned from her mother, who had used it in dialysis chairs and hospital waiting rooms, and every place where the body needed to be talked down from what the mind had been asking it to do. In, hold out, slower than felt natural. Again the corridor was quiet. The estate was not, she could hear, distantly, the sound of the external situation being resolved, vehicles and voices and the particular acoustic signature of organized people completing organized tasks. But the corridor itself was quiet, and she stood in it and let the quiet work on her for a minute that felt longer than a minute. Then she went to find Pete Harlow. Pete was in the staff room. He had been there since early morning, since Victor's team had contained him in place. And when she opened the door, he was sitting at the small table, with his hands around a coffee mug that had long since gone cold, and when he saw her, his face did the thing she had been waiting 11 months to see it do. It stopped performing. The smile was gone. The cheerful, frictionless, entirely constructed surface that Pete Harlow had maintained for 14 months in this house was simply absent, and what was underneath it was younger and more tired than she'd expected. He looked like a person who had been carrying something for a very long time and had just understood that he could put it down, not because it was resolved, but because carrying it further wasn't possible. She sat down across from him. "How old are you?" she said. He blinked. 24. She had thought early 30s. Performance had added years that the face unguarded did not have. "When did they recruit you?" He looked at the coffee mug. "Before I applied here. Someone contacted me about the job. Said there was a position, gave me the details, said they'd help me get it." A pause. "I needed the money. I have a sister." "It doesn't matter." "It matters," Mara said. "It's not going to change what happens next, but it matters." He looked at her. His eyes were red at the edges in the way that came from sustained sleeplessness rather than recent tears. "I didn't know anyone was going to get hurt. I thought I was just passing information. Messages. I didn't know what the messages were for." "At what point did you figure it out?" A long pause. "When Mr. Kessler got sick, I put it together." He stopped. "Kept doing it anyway." She sat with that, the honesty of it, specific ugliness of the moment when a person understands what they're part of and continues. She didn't say anything about it because there was nothing to say that he hadn't already said to himself in this chair over the past several hours. "Victor is going to come talk to you," she said. "Tell him everything. Contact sequence, the dead drop protocol, the timing, all of it. Don't try to manage it. Just tell him." "And then what?" "And then that's up to Dorian." She stood. "But you're 24, and your sister needs you functional. So tell Victor everything." She left him there. She did not feel clean about any of it, and she was not going to pretend that she did. Dr. Nella Voss was next. Mara found her in the East Wing quarters, still dressed, still sitting on the edge of the bed in the same posture she'd observed on the camera, the night before, hands folded, enduring. When Mara came in, Voss looked up and did not perform surprise. She had been waiting for this, too. "How long?" Mara said. Voss looked at the window. "Since before I arrived. The referral to join the consulting team came through a colleague. I didn't know until the third day that the colleague had been approached by someone outside the medical community." She paused. "By then I had already shared one set of readings." And you continued. "I was told that if I didn't, my colleague would be exposed. He hadn't known what he was facilitating. He would have lost his license." Her voice was flat and precise and carried the particular quality of a person who had rehearsed their justification until it sounded like fact. "I made a choice. You made a choice that nearly killed your patient." Voss said nothing. Did you falsify any of the actual treatment protocols? Mara asked. Not the records, the treatment itself. No. Sharp. The first sharp thing she'd heard from Voss. I treated him correctly. Every intervention I made was medically appropriate. I know, Mara said. I checked. Voss looked at her. Something in her face shifted, not gratitude, but the specific response of a person who has been braced for a version of this conversation that did not include someone having checked their work. Your colleague, Mara said. He'll need to be talked to. I know, Victor will need his name. I know that too. Voss unfolded her hands, looked at them. They were a doctor's hands, precise, cared for, and currently not steady. I am aware of the full scope of what I did. Mara left her with that. It was all she had to leave her with. The morning moved into afternoon the way mornings after large events did, faster, in some ways slower in others, the normal architecture of time distorted by the density of what had happened inside it. She found herself in the kitchen at some point, not because anyone had sent her there, but because her body, tired and running on the last reserves of a very long 24 hours, wanted something familiar. She made coffee, real coffee, in the kitchen she had cleaned for 11 months, in the quiet that followed the departure of the last external vehicles from the estate grounds. Gareth's kitchen. Gareth, who was somewhere being questioned, who had been handed a protocol and told it was a supplement, who may or may not have understood what he was carrying. She had never found a clean answer to Gareth and suspected she wasn't going to. Some people were complicit, and some people were used, and some people were somewhere in the space between those things, and the line was not always where you needed it to be. She was on her second cup when Dorian came into the kitchen. This was unprecedented. In 11 months, she had never seen Dorian Kessler in the kitchen. It was not a room he occupied. She was briefly certain she was more tired than she'd realized and was imagining it. She was not imagining it. Came in with the careful deliberateness of a man managing a body that had done more today than it should have. And he sat down at the prep counter on the stool that Pete had habitually used, and he looked at her across the counter. Victor tells me the coastal transfer is processing, he said. Good. Julian is in custody. His operational network is being wound down by the account's freeze. The affiliates are already distancing. He paused. Varric's arm is fractured in 2 places. He's been seen by a doctor and transported. He'll fulfill the agreement. How do you know? Because Varric is a professional, and professionals honor agreements that are in their interest. A pause. And because I know what's in his interest better than he does now. Poured a second cup and set it in front of him. He looked at it. Then he looked at her with the full level attention she'd come to recognize as the face he used when he was not performing anything. The holding company, he said. He says he'll provide dissolution documentation. I know. Victor told me. He picked up the cup, set it down without drinking. That's not what I mean, she waited. Someone built a frame for you 18 months before you applied for this job, he said, which means someone knew you were going to be here, or positioned you to be here. He held her eyes. I need to know which one it is. She had known this conversation was coming, She had been carrying it. Fitzgiron that had said her name in the security office at 4 a.m, since the floor had stayed still and she'd made herself breathe. My mother, she said. Dorian waited. Was a dialysis patient for 6 years. During that time, she interacted with the medical infrastructure of several organizations. She was not a criminal, but she was poor, and poor sick people in certain cities end up in contact with medical services that are not strictly conventional. She held his gaze. One of the clinics she used for infusion services was connected to the coastal network. I found out after she died, a 1.5 years ago, and you decided to come here. I decided to find out what I could find out. She stopped, started again. Not for revenge. I want to be specific about that. My mother died because of medications mismanagement, not because of Varric or anyone connected to him. The clinic that failed her was connected to a financial network that was connected to people who made decisions about what services were available in her neighborhood and at what cost. I wanted to understand that network, so you applied for a job inside it. I applied for a job as a housekeeper in the estate of a man whose organization intersected with the coastal network. I was not working for Varric. I was not placed here by Varric. The holding company in my name was Varick's insurance policy. He found my application in the estate's hiring records and recognized the opportunity to create a fallback asset. She paused. I was here for my own reasons. He tried to use that. And your reasons, Dorian said. What did you find? She looked at him. At this man who had come into a kitchen he never occupied, on the afternoon after nearly being killed twice in the same month, to ask her a direct question rather than have Victor ask it for him. I found that the clinic's funding had been restructured before my mother's final year, she said. The restructuring had cut the medication management program that might have caught the interaction that killed her, and that the restructuring decision had been made by a financial officer in the coastal network, whose documentation was now, as of this morning, part of an active investigation. Dorian was quiet for a moment. You got what you came for. I got more than I came for, she said. I didn't come here to save your life or dismantle Varick's operation. I came here to understand something. The rest of it happened because I was paying attention. You're always paying attention. Yes. He picked up the coffee, drank it this time, set the cup down and looked at the counter between them at the clear expanse of the prep surface, the kitchen quiet around them, the afternoon gray light through the windows. She had cleaned this counter hundreds of times. She had cleaned everything in this room. I want you to stay, he said. She looked at him, not surprised she had felt its coming in the shape of the last several days. But hearing it said out loud was different from feeling it approach. As what, she said. As what you already are. He looked at her directly. I have security staff. I have lieutenants. I have lawyers and accountants and people who have been doing their jobs for 20 years and who missed what you saw in 6 weeks. He paused. I need someone who sees systems, who sees the thing underneath the thing, who can move through a room and come back with information that no one else knew to look for. That's not a job title, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. She thought about what it meant. Not the abstract version, the concrete version. Staying in this house, in this organization, in proximity to a man whose world was exactly as dangerous as the past several weeks had demonstrated. Cost of that. The specific weight of continuing to be the person who saw everything and was now known to see everything, which meant she was no longer invisible and had lost the only armor she'd reliably had. She also thought about the clinic, about the financial documentation now in the investigation, about the network of decisions that had shaped the last years of her mother's life, and how much of that network was still running, still making decisions about which services were available and at what cost in which neighborhoods, and how much more of it she could map from a position of access versus a position of invisibility. I want one thing, she said. Ask. The investigation that Bertrand filed this morning. Financial crimes documentation. I want access to the full evidentiary record as it develops. Not as a staff member, as a named party with independent access. Dorian looked at her. Why? Because there are decisions in that record that affected people who had nothing to do with your organization or Varick's, who were just sick and poor and in the wrong place in a network they couldn't see. She held his eyes. I want to make sure those decisions are in the documentation. He was quiet for a long time. The kitchen was very still. Outside, somewhere on the estate grounds, she could hear the sound of the security staff completing their sweep footsteps on gravel. A radio, the normal sounds of a house returning to its operational baseline after a disruption. Done, Dorian said. She nodded. Then I'll stay. Finished his coffee. Set the cup down with a care. That was also a kind of finality, the gesture of a man closing one chapter of a conversation and preparing to live in the next one. He stood up from the stool with the same deliberate management of his body that he'd shown all day, and she watched him stand and thought about the man she'd observed for 11 months from corners and doorways and service corridors. The man who had been performed at and managed and surrounded by people who wanted things from him. And how different he looked in a kitchen with no one watching but her. There's one more thing, she said. He waited, called her. She had been sitting with this one. He was recruited, leveraged, and used. He signed a document without understanding its full implications. He was in debt and ambitious, and those are not crimes. She paused. He also threw a tray at my face in a hallway. Something moved across Dorian's expression. Not quite amusement, the closest relative of it. What are you asking? I'm not asking for anything. I'm telling you the full picture so you have it. She met his eyes. What you do with Calder is your decision. I just want you to make it with the complete information. He looked at her for a long moment. He knew, Dorian said finally. Maybe not the full scope, but he knew enough. He chose anyway. Yes, she said. He did. That's the full picture, Dorian said. She didn't argue. She had said what she had to say. He left the kitchen. She stayed in it, washed through the 2 coffee cups, and sent them on the drying rack and wiped the counter, and then stopped, hands flat on the clean surface, and looked at the room around her. 11 months. Every corner of it, every drawer and shelf, and the specific way the light came through the windows in the early morning, when the grounds were still and the house was quiet and she was the only person in it who was awake and watching. She was not the housekeeper anymore. She had said it twice today and meant it both times. But she was still a person who noticed that the 3rd cup on the shelf was slightly out of alignment with the other 2. And she reached up and straightened it without thinking about it, and then caught herself doing it and felt something that was not quite amusement and not quite grief, and was probably the specific emotion that existed at the intersection of who you were and who you were becoming. She turned off the kitchen light and walked out. Victor was in the main corridor, waiting with the particular quality of a man who had been waiting long enough to have stopped being impatient about it. He looked at her as she came out of the kitchen and said nothing for a moment. The coastal documentation, she said. Dorian agreed to independent access. I know, he told me. And Pete? Cooperating fully. His sister's situation is being looked into. He paused. I made a call. She looked at him. You didn't have to do that. No, he agreed. I didn't have to. He said it in the way that meant they were not going to have a longer conversation about it, and she accepted this. What happens tomorrow? She said. Tomorrow the estate returns to operational status. The documentation proceeds through the appropriate channels. Coastal Network processes transfer. Julian's assets remain frozen pending the outcome of the investigation. He paused. And you sit down with Bertrand and start going through the full Varick financial record. So, we understand exactly what we've acquired. She nodded. What time? 8. I'll be there. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, the corridor. When you held the aide against the wall. He stopped, started again. I've done what you did in that corridor. I've done harder things in harder places. But you've never done any of it. No, she said. Are you all right? She thought about it. The honest version. Her hands, which had held a wrist at the wrong angle, and felt the impact of a person meeting a wall. Crystal pitcher, cold and heavy in her grip. The dark room and the gray light and the 6 footprints on the ground and 30 seconds that she had used without wasting any of them. I'm all right, she said. I'll tell you when I'm not. He nodded. It was the right answer, and they both knew it. She went to her room, the same room she had lived in for 11 months. Small, clean, with the single window that looked out over the east side of the estate grounds and caught the morning light at an angle that had always made her think of her mother's kitchen. She sat on the edge of the bed, still in her jacket, still in her work shoes. Outside the window, the afternoon was moving toward evening, the gray light softening toward the specific quality of late day and early autumn, when the sky couldn't quite commit to any color, and everything was muted and strangely clear at the same time. She could see the estate grounds from here, the manicured surface of them, the fence line, the gate in the distance. Everything in place, everything where it belonged. She thought about her mother, not the hospital version, not the dialysis chair version, the kitchen version. Her mother at the kitchen table with medication sheets spread in front of her, reading them out loud because that was how she processed things. Her voice going slightly flat when she hit a term she didn't recognize, and then continuing anyway, because continuing anyway was what she did. Mara sitting across from her, reading along, learning the language of it without meaning to, building a catalog of detail that had sat in her head for 6 years without anyone finding a use for it. Until the pressure, medication ones, a dying on man's medication case was sitting open on the wrong side of his nightstand. And all of that accumulated, purposeless attention had suddenly had somewhere to go. She thought about the word invisible, how she had used it as armor, and how Dorian had used it as a resource, and how Varick had used it as a blind spot, and how all 3 of those things had been true, simultaneously, and how the same quality in a person could serve all those purposes, depending entirely on who was doing the looking. She was not invisible anymore. That was gone. She had broken a man's arm in a corridor in front of security cameras and stood in a room full of syndicate leadership and said things that could not be unsaid and held the pressure until the light changed. And the person who had moved through this house for 11 months was not the person sit down Bertrand till tomorrow morning at 8. She was not sure yet what the new version cost. She suspected she was going to find out. But she also knew, and this was the thing that kept her from the particular vertigo of transition, the thing her mother would have called keeping your feet, that she had come here for a reason, and the reason had been served, and she had not burned herself up in the serving of it. The investigation was in motion. The documentation existed. The decisions that had shaped the last years of her mother's life were in a file that would be read by people with the authority to act on what they found. She had not planned for any of the rest of it. She had not planned to find a man being poisoned, or to save him, or to dismantle the operation targeting him, or to end up on the operational side of a syndicate she had come here to understand from the outside. She had planned to watch, to learn, to document, and to leave. Plans were the first casualty of paying attention. She knew that now. She took off her jacket, hung it on the hook behind the door, took off her work shoes and set them neatly beside the bed, lay back on top of the covers and looked at the ceiling, which she had also cleaned many times, and which was, like everything else in this house, exactly as clean as it needed to be. She was asleep before the light outside the window finished fading. In the morning, at 7:55, she walked into the room where Bertrand was waiting with 32 folders arranged on the table in front of him, and she sat down across from him. And she started reading. She did not bring the cleaning caddy. She did not need it anymore.